Imagine settling into something comfortable. Maybe you're already in bed, the room dark and quiet around you, or perhaps you're stretched out on a couch with the lights dimmed low. Whatever you chose tonight, let your body relax into it fully, because what we're about to explore together is a story so strange, so improbable, that historians have spent centuries trying to fully explain it. Before we go any further, a small question. Where are you right now? Drop a comment and tell us what time it is where you're listening from, and where in the world you happen to be. There is something quietly remarkable about the idea that people in different time zones, different countries, different seasons, are all drifting towards sleep with the same story filling their ears. We would love to know where you are. Now let your breathing slow a little and follow this thought. There was once an empire so vast, so deeply rooted in the land it controlled, that the people who lived inside it could not have imagined its end. It stretched across mountains higher than most of the world's peaks, along coastlines that ran for thousands of miles through deserts so dry that almost nothing could live there, and into rainforests so dense that sunlight barely reached the floor. It had endured for generations. It had absorbed kingdoms, resettled whole populations, built roads that crossed terrain that would challenge a modern engineer. Its rulers were considered children of the sun itself. For roughly 3 centuries, this empire had expanded and adapted and survived everything the ancient world could send against it. And then, one afternoon in November of 1532, it effectively ended. Not over years of grinding war, not through a slow erosion of power or a long decline. In a single afternoon, in a dusty plaza in a highland city called Cajamarca, the course of an entire civilization bent sharply and permanently in a new direction. The men responsible for that afternoon numbered 168. 168 soldiers, most of them not professional military men in any formal sense, many of them adventurers and opportunists who had crossed an ocean on the strength of rumour and ambition. They had no maps of the land they were walking through. They had no supply lines stretching back to a friendly coast. They were by any reasonable measure absurdly outnumbered. The empire they were walking into could field armies of tens of thousands. It had a ruler who commanded the labour and loyalty of millions of people across a territory roughly the size of the eastern coast of the United States, from one end to the other, and yet, that is the mystery at the centre of this story, and it is one worth sitting with as you drift towards sleep tonight. Not because the answer is simple, and not because what happened was inevitable. Historians still debate the precise combination of forces that made that afternoon possible. There were factors the invaders brought with them, some carried in their hands and some carried invisibly in their bodies. There were fractures already running through the empire itself, cracks that had opened before the strangers ever arrived. There were decisions made and not made, warnings given and not heeded. There was the strangeness of first contact between 2 worlds that had developed entirely separately for thousands of years, each one utterly unprepared to fully understand the other. The empire was the Inca. The men who arrived that afternoon were led by a Spanish conquistador named Francisco Pizarro. The wider moment was the early 16th century, a period when European powers were reaching outward across oceans with extraordinary speed and extraordinary violence, encountering civilizations they did not understand and claiming them with a confidence that defied all common sense. But common sense, as this story will show, was not always the deciding factor. Tonight we are going to walk through this story together, slowly, from the beginning. We will see the empire as it actually was, in all its complexity and power. We will follow the road that led to Cajamarca. We will stand in that plaza when the light was still bright and everything was about to change, and by the end, the afternoon that should not have happened might begin to feel, if not inevitable, then at least possible in a way that unsettles you just enough to be interesting. Settle in. The mountains are waiting. To understand what was lost that afternoon in Cajamarca, you have to first understand what was there before the strangers arrived. And what was there was something genuinely remarkable, something that had no parallel anywhere else on earth at that moment. The Inca did not begin as an empire. They began as something much smaller, a group of people settled around a highland city called Cusco, high in the Andes of what is now Peru. The stories they told about their own origins spoke of divine emergence, of ancestors who stepped out of sacred places in the earth and were guided by the sun itself to found their city. Whether you take those stories as history or as poetry, they tell you something important about how the Inca understood themselves. They were not simply a people, they were chosen. And their ruler, the Sapa Inca, was not simply a king. He was the son of the sun, Inti, the great burning presence that moved across the sky and made life possible in this difficult, high, thin-aired world. But divinity alone does not build an empire. What built this one was a combination of military pressure, strategic marriage, diplomatic absorption, and an extraordinary willingness to incorporate conquered peoples rather than simply crush them. Beginning roughly in the early 15th century, the Inca expanded outward from Cusco with a speed that is almost difficult to credit. Within about 100 years, they had gone from a regional power to the largest empire in the Western Hemisphere. By the time Francisco Pizarro was walking through their territory in 1532, the empire stretched from what is now southern Colombia in the north all the way down through Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and into Chile and Argentina in the south. Some estimates place its territory at around 2 million square kilometers. The population it governed was likely somewhere between 10 and 12 million people, possibly more, spread across a staggering variety of environments. And this is where the geography becomes essential to understanding everything that follows. Picture the Andes, not as a background detail, not as scenery, but as the defining fact of life for everyone who lived within the empire. These are not gentle mountains. They are among the most dramatic and unforgiving landscapes on the planet. Peaks that rise above 6,000 meters, passes where the air is so thin that lowland travelers feel the world going strange around them. Valleys that drop sharply from those heights into tropical warmth, almost vertiginous transitions within a few days of walking. Along the western edge, one of the driest deserts on Earth runs for thousands of miles beside a cold and often foggy coast. On the eastern slopes, the mountains tumble down into the Amazon basin, into heat and density and rain. This was not terrain that an outside power could simply walk into and dominate. It demanded that whoever controlled it actually understood it, had built their systems around its logic, had learned how to move through it, store food in it, communicate across it. The Inca had done exactly this over generations. The mountains that looked like barriers to outsiders were, for them, a kind of armoured interior. The altitude itself was a weapon, the cold a storage system, the peaks both fortress walls and sacred presences that the empire wove into its religious life. And religion was not separate from politics here. It was the same thing. The Sapa Inca ruled not just through military power, but through a framework of sacred meaning that made his authority feel like a natural feature of the world, as fixed and obvious as the mountains themselves. He was believed to be divine, and this was not an abstract claim that people quietly doubted. It shaped everything from how he was seen in public, carried on a litter so that his feet did not touch common ground, to what happened to his body after death. Previous rulers were not buried and forgotten. Their mummified remains were maintained in their palaces, consulted on important matters, brought out for ceremonies. The dead kings of the Inca were still, in a very real political sense, present. They still owned the land and resources they had accumulated in life. New Sapa Incas had to conquer new territory, because the wealth of the old ones remained in the hands of the deceased and their descendants. This practice, which scholars sometimes call split inheritance, was one of the driving engines of expansion. The empire grew in part because each new ruler needed his own resources, his own glory, his own solar mandate made visible. This layered system of divine authority, ancestor power, sacred geography, and ritual obligation bound together a collection of peoples who spoke different languages, worshipped their own local deities, and had their own distinct identities. The Inca did not erase those identities. They placed them within a larger framework, demanded tribute and labour and loyalty, but allowed a great deal of local practice to continue. Local leaders, called curachas, were often kept in their positions. If they cooperated, their children sometimes brought to Cusco to be educated and incorporated into Inca culture, a kind of soft hostage diplomacy that also spread Inca language and values across the territory. It was a system sophisticated enough to hold together an extraordinary diversity of peoples and places, and it had been doing so, expanding and adapting and absorbing for roughly 300 years before any Europeans set foot on the continent. In all that time, the empire had never faced what you might call a decisive open defeat. There had been rebellions, some of them serious. There had been peoples who resisted absorption for years. There had been military campaigns that proved difficult and costly, but the Inca had always eventually prevailed. There were frontier zones where expansion had slowed or stalled, particularly in the lowland jungles to the east, where the terrain erased the empire's advantages. But within the Andean world it had defined as its own, the Inca stood without a serious rival. No other Andean power had successfully challenged them in the field and turned the result into lasting independence. This mattered not just as military fact, but as psychological reality. The empire's image of itself, the story it told to newly absorbed peoples and to its own citizens alike, included this unbroken record. The sun favoured his children. The divine order backed the Sapa Inca. The mountains themselves seemed to confirm it. 3 centuries of expansion, of defeat piled onto defeat for anyone who stood in the way, had built something that looked, from the inside, like permanence. When the strangers began arriving on the coast, asking questions, sending messages, moving slowly inland, most people within the empire had no framework for understanding what they actually were or what they intended. And why would they? The Inca world was the world. It was vast. It was ancient by any living person's measure. It was held together by sacred authority and hard experience. Whatever these strange men were, the empire had absorbed stranger things before, or so it seemed, from high in the mountains, in the thin, clear air above Cusco, where the sun still moved across the sky in its daily arc and everything, for just a little while longer, still made sense. But to understand how something so large held together at all, you have to look past the sacred stories and the divine rulers and ask a more practical question. How, exactly, do you run an empire across 2 million square kilometers of some of the most difficult terrain on Earth? How do you move armies, feed populations, collect tribute, respond to crises, and keep the whole intricate structure from collapsing under its own weight? The answer the Inca arrived at was roads. Not roads in the way we tend to picture them, not simple beaten paths worn into the earth by repeated use, but a deliberate engineered network that covered somewhere in the range of 40,000 kilometers by the time the empire reached its fullest extent. 2 main trunks ran roughly north to south, one along the coast and one through the highlands, and these were connected by cross routes that stitched the whole system together into something that functioned almost like a nervous system. The roads climbed passes that would leave a modern traveller gasping. They cut across desert, spanned rivers on suspension bridges woven from plant fibre, followed stone causeways over marshy ground. In some mountain sections they were carved directly into cliff faces. In others, stone steps were laid to make the ascent manageable for human feet and the llamas that carried goods along them. These roads were not built for casual travel. They were infrastructure in the fullest sense of the word, an expression of state power made physical. Ordinary people did not simply wander the royal roads for personal reasons. Movement along them was organised, purposeful, controlled, and threaded along these roads, at regular intervals of roughly a day's journey apart, were small stations called tambos. These were rest points, supply depots, and administrative nodes all at once. A traveller on official business could stop, eat, sleep, and continue. An army on the move could be provisioned without stripping the countryside bare. A message could be handed off to a fresh runner and continue on its way without pause. Which brings you to one of the more quietly astonishing features of this entire system. The relay runners. These were young men stationed at the tambos, trained from youth for speed and endurance at altitude. A message, an object, a command from the Sapa Inca could be passed from runner to runner along the road network at speeds that rival estimates suggest might have covered somewhere between 200 and 400 kilometers in a single day under favourable conditions. Fresh fish from the coast reportedly reached Cusco this way. Military intelligence travelled the same routes. The empire, in this sense, had something that functioned like rapid communication across distances that would otherwise have taken weeks to traverse on foot. For a world without wheels, without horses outside of ceremonial use, without writing as most civilizations defined it, This was remarkable. And then there were the storehouses. Scattered across the empire, particularly at high altitudes where the cold served as a natural refrigerant, were hundreds, possibly thousands, of state storehouses called kolkas. The thin, dry mountain air was almost perfectly suited for preservation, and the Inca exploited this fact systematically. Freeze-dried potatoes, dried meat, preserved grains, textiles, weapons, sandals, tools. The contents of these storehouses were catalogued and tracked, and they served as the material foundation of the entire labour system. Because the Inca did not tax their subjects in gold or silver or crops taken directly, they taxed in labour. Every household in the empire owed a portion of its time and energy to the state, a system called mita. You might work on road construction, on building temples or storehouses, on mining, on farming state lands, on military service. In return, the state fed and equipped you from those storehouses while you worked. It was a relationship of obligation and redistribution, and it was the engine that built almost everything the empire contained. What made this system function across such distances and such diversity was an administrative apparatus that was, by any measure, extraordinarily sophisticated for a civilization without alphabetic writing. This is where the quipu enters the picture. A quipu was a device made of knotted cords, typically hanging from a main horizontal string, with knots tied at specific positions indicating numerical values. They were used for record keeping across the empire, for census data, tribute records, population counts, storehouse inventories. Trained specialists called quipucamayocs could read and create them, and they formed a kind of administrative class that kept the empire's books without a single written word in the conventional sense. Some researchers have suggested that certain quipus may have encoded narrative information, as well as numerical data, though that remains an area of ongoing scholarly investigation rather than settled fact. What is clear is that the state maintained a detailed, systematic awareness of its resources and its people, in a way that supported centralized decision-making on a grand scale. Local querellas reported to regional governors. Regional governors answered upward through a hierarchy that ultimately connected to Cusco and to the Sapa Inca himself. Census-like counts tracked populations, assessed labor obligations, recorded births and deaths. The empire knew, with some reasonable approximation, what it had and where it was. To anyone looking at this system from the outside, whether a neighbouring people considering resistance or a European stranger stumbling into its margins, the whole apparatus must have seemed overwhelming. The roads went everywhere. The storehouses were full. The runners moved with eerie speed. The officials kept their careful knotted records. The army could be fed and supplied across distances that would have broken a European logistics chain entirely. But there was something else embedded in all of this, something that looked like strength, but carried a quiet vulnerability inside it. Everything depended on the centre. The roads radiated outward from Cusco. The storehouse system was organized around state priorities. The quipus fed their information upward through a hierarchy. The relay runners carried the will of the Sapa Inca to the furthest corners of the empire at remarkable speed. But what they carried was commands from a single source. The whole magnificent system was calibrated to function under a clear, uncontested authority at the top. Remove that authority, or throw it into doubt, and you would not simply inconvenience the empire. You would begin to dissolve the logic that held it together. That vulnerability was invisible as long as nothing challenged the centre, and for 300 years nothing had. When you followed those roads out from Cusco, you did not walk into empty land. You walked into valleys with their own histories, their own sacred places, their own rivalries that went back generations before anyone in the highland capital had ever spoken the name of Inti or the title Sapa Inca. The genius of the empire was not only that it could reach these places, it was that, once it arrived, it could make them part of something larger without always burning them to the ground. Not never, just not always. Conquest usually began with a choice. Sometimes the Inca army marched into a region in overwhelming force, armor gleaming, standards flying, drums and shell trumpets announcing that the world was about to change. Representatives of the Sapa Inca would offer terms. You could submit peacefully. You could accept the sun as the highest power, recognize the Sapa Inca as the child of that sun, and agree to provide labor, soldiers, and loyalty when called. If you did that, if your local lord bent the knee and presented hostages, the transition might be surprisingly gentle on the surface. The old ruler might keep his lands, his titles, his house. His people might continue farming the same fields, worshipping many of the same local gods. There would be Inca officials now, yes, and new obligations, and the quiet pressure to reshape daily life according to imperial norms. But you would be inside the system, not under its heel. If you refused, if you fought, the outcome could be very different. Chroniclers writing after the fall describe cities taken by storm, leaders executed, populations marched off to distant lands. These accounts are coloured by hindsight and politics, but there is enough consistency to suggest that the threat was real. Refusal could mean devastation. Later generations remembered that, so Inca rule, from the very beginning, rested on a mixture of promise and fear. On one side there was reciprocity. Submit, and the state would bring roads, storehouses, terraced fields carved into steep slopes, irrigation works that could transform marginal land into reliable harvests. In times of famine, state granaries would open. In times of war, the Inca would send armies to defend allies against their enemies. Local elites could marry into the imperial nobility, send their sons to be educated in Cusco, receive fine textiles and ceremonial privileges that marked them as part of something grand. On the other side there was coercion, refuse, and you might find your fields burned, your leaders taken in chains, your people forced to walk hundreds of kilometers away from the mountains or valleys they had known for generations. This policy of moving people was not accidental. It was a deliberate tool. The Inca called the system mitmacuna. Outside observers later called these moved communities mitimes. After a region was conquered, a portion of its population might be uprooted and resettled far away, sometimes in recently subdued areas, sometimes in more secure heartland territories. In their place, loyal subjects from other parts of the empire might be planted. The logic was straightforward, in a stark kind of way. A people separated from their ancestral lands might be less likely to rebel. A rebellious region, salted with newcomers who owed their position to the Inca, might calm down. Skilled farmers could be shifted to frontier areas where their knowledge was needed. Artisans and specialists could be redeployed to serve imperial projects in distant locales. Of course, for the people being moved, this was not simply administration. It was loss. Loss of familiar mountains, sacred springs, ancestors buried in a particular soil. Loss of stories tied to particular stones and trees and stars over a particular horizon. The Inca tried to soften that, at least in theory. Communities were usually moved together rather than scattered. Their leaders often went with them. They were given land to farm in their new home. They could bring their customs, their language, their clothing. But the message was clear. Your life, your roots, your geography are not entirely your own anymore. They are part of the emperor's map. This combination of alliance and displacement, carrot and stick, extended all the way down into everyday authority. At the top, local lords, curacas, were folded into the imperial hierarchy. A curaca who cooperated could keep his immediate power, but he now answered to Inca governors, who answered to higher officials, who ultimately answered to Cusco. To mark this new relationship, the empire offered gifts that were not just material, but symbolic. Fine cloth, for instance, was more than fabric. Certain kinds of textiles and patterns were restricted, reserved for the nobility and for people the state wanted to honour. Receiving them was like being handed a visible badge of status. To wear them was to advertise that your prestige, your elevated position among your own people, now flowed partially from the Sapa Inca's favour. Some elites embraced this. If you had spent your life jockeying with neighbouring chiefs for dominance, aligning yourself with the greatest power in the Andes could settle old disputes in your favour. You could call on imperial soldiers in your quarrels. You could use the state's demands, its censuses, its labour quotas, as tools to discipline your own rivals. You might send your children to Cusco, where they would learn the imperial language, Quechua, take part in ceremonies, absorb the style and worldview of the capital. They could come back as adults, both local and imperial, at once. Others cooperated because they felt they had no real choice. They had seen what happened to those who resisted. They handed over hostages. They mobilized labor when asked. They attended festivals and recited the right words. But beneath the surface, resentment simmered. Part of that resentment came from the mechanics of the mita itself. For the empire, the labor tax was a grand system of mutual obligation. The state called up workers in rotation, fed and clothed them while they served, and then sent them home again. On a large scale, this could look like a powerful safety net. In bad years, when crops failed, storehouses opened. In good years, surplus labor went into roads, terraces, temples, investments that would theoretically benefit everyone. On the ground, in specific communities, the balance could feel different. If your village was small, if harvests were thin, if a local cuirassier or an imperial official was overzealous in meeting quotas, the burden of sending working-age adults away for weeks or months at a time could be crushing. Fields at home might be neglected. Families might struggle while their strongest members were building temples for gods they did not entirely recognize. And yet, you would also remember the years when state grain kept starvation away. It was never simply one thing or the other. Obligation and gratitude, exploitation and protection, were knotted together as tightly as the cords of a quipu. Holding all of this together, these shifting calculations of benefit and loss, was something less tangible than roads or storehouses. It was the story the empire told about itself. When Inca representatives arrived, they did not just bring soldiers and officials, they brought a cosmology, a framework that tried to make all these changes feel like part of the natural order of the universe. The sun, Inti, was central. The Sapa Inca was his child on earth, the axis around which human society should revolve. Local deities, local sacred places, the mountains and springs and rocks that people had honored for generations, were not necessarily abolished. Often they were folded into a hierarchy. They might be acknowledged, even respected, but they were now understood as lesser powers, subordinate to the great sun and to the Huacas of Cusco. To make this hierarchy real, the empire built. Massive temples, plazas, and fortresses rose in strategic places. Stonework so precise that later visitors would run their fingers along the joins and wonder how it had been done without iron tools or wheels. In some conquered regions, the Inca constructed new ceremonial centers near old ones, subtly shifting the axis of sacred geography. The message was not subtle at all. Here is power made stone. Here is a place where the emperor's rituals unfold, where the sun's favor is called down for the whole world. Ceremonies tied distant communities to this center. Each year, delegations from across the empire might come to Cusco for major festivals. They brought local offerings, wore their provincial dress, and stood in ordered ranks, visible proof that dozens, perhaps hundreds, of peoples now formed a single political and sacred community. At home, state-sponsored rituals reinforced the same idea in miniature. Sacrifices were made, libations poured, dances performed, not only for local spirits but in honor of the imperial order that people were told kept the seasons turning and the world in balance. Religion in this sense was not separate from politics. It was one of the main ways politics was made to feel inevitable. If the sun's child ruled, then paying labor tax was not simply a legal duty, it was part of keeping cosmic harmony. If state officials arrived to oversee planting calendars, they were not just bureaucrats. They were representatives of a larger knowledge that claimed to understand when the rain should fall and how the land should be used. Still, beneath the shared festivals and neatly ranked delegations, the empire was never a seamless whole. Old rivalries persisted. Two neighboring groups might both now be Inca subjects, but their history of feuds and grudges did not vanish. In fact, imperial rule sometimes sharpened those lines. A cuirassier who aligned early with Cusco might be favored, his enemies targeted as unreliable. Micmac settlements could sit uncomfortably alongside longer-established communities, their different accents and customs marking them as outsiders even decades after they arrived. In times of stability, these fault lines might stay quiet. The benefits of roads and security and redistribution could soothe a great deal. Children could grow up knowing no other order of things than that the Sapa Inca ruled from far away, that their parents occasionally went to work on state projects, that the sun's festivals always came on schedule. But under the surface, memories remained. Stories of forced marches to new lands, stories of ancestors who had died resisting, stories of injustice, real or perceived, in how burdens were distributed, how favours were granted, how judges had ruled in disputes between locals and imperial officials. All of that remained like hairline cracks in stone. Looked at from above, from Cusco, the empire could seem like a single body, its roads and runners and storehouses all working in coordinated harmony. Looked at from below, from a village plucked up and moved across the mountains, from a defeated chief kept in his house under the watchful eye of distant governors, it could feel more fragile, more conditional. The Inca had managed something rare. They had woven many peoples into a single imperial fabric without entirely erasing their separate threads. That was their strength. It was also quietly their risk. Because when the centre that bound those threads together began to fray, all those old colours, all those older loyalties and grievances would still be there, waiting. The first tear in that central thread did not come from an enemy army. It came from within the royal family itself. For decades, one man had stood at the centre of the empire's story, Huayna Capac, the Sapa Inca. Under his rule, the frontiers had pushed further, the storehouses had filled higher, the roads had carried more runners than ever before. His name was woven into prayers and proclamations, into the memories of battles fought and lands absorbed. Then, suddenly, he was gone. Even the manner of his going carried unease. Many accounts suggest that disease, something new and terrible, swept through the Andes in the years before the Spaniards themselves appeared. A sickness that did not fit neatly into old patterns of famine or ordinary plague. Huayna Capac died far from Cusco, possibly in the north, in the lands he had recently brought into the imperial fold. With him died one of his chosen heirs. What had seemed solid, succession, authority, the clear descent of power from father to son, became uncertain in a way that the empire had not had to face on this scale before. The Inca state had rituals and expectations for choosing the next Sapa Inca. In theory, the emperor named a successor from among his sons, especially those born of noble women recognized as principal wives. In practice, there was always room for maneuver, negotiation, and quiet struggle. Brothers might compete, nobles might whisper, alliances might form behind this prince or that. But most of the time, the process ended with a single man raised up, carried through Cusco in ceremony, wrapped in the symbols of the sun's favour. Disputes that had simmered in the background were expected to yield to that public choice. This time, they did not. When Huayna Capac died, the empire did not get one clear successor. It effectively got two. In the capital, many of the high nobles and administrators recognized Huascar, a son of Huayna Capac with strong ceremonial claims and the advantage of being in Cusco, the heart of the old order. He was crowned, given the emblems of rulership, and acknowledged as Sapa Inca by the elites who had long made the city their stage. Far to the north, another son held power on the ground. Atahualpa had grown up in the world his father had carved out beyond the traditional heartland. He knew the northern provinces, the newly conquered cities, the frontier garrisons. He had the loyalty of veteran generals who had campaigned with Huayna Capac in those regions. He had armies at his back. On paper, in the formal language of ritual and genealogy, Huascar was the emperor. In the camps, on the roads, in the fortresses that guarded passes and valleys, Atahualpa was not merely a prince who should quietly step aside. He was a living focus of loyalty for thousands of armed men who had shed blood in his company. At first, the tension between these two centres of power did not necessarily look like full-scale civil war. Messages travelled along the roads. Envoys moved between north and south. Demands and refusals passed from one court to the other, but the empire's machinery, all those roads and messengers and carefully ranked officials, was suddenly carrying something it had not been designed to handle, the possibility that its own head had split in two. Every provincial governor, every curacha folded into the hierarchy, had to make an uncomfortable calculation. Whose name should they invoke in prayers? Whose emissaries should they honour most lavishly? When an order came from Cusco and another, slightly different one, arrived from the north, which should they obey? In a state held together by both belief and practical advantage, that kind of uncertainty was dangerous. It did not stay uncertain forever. Lines were drawn. Huascar, in Cusco, asserted his authority in a way that, according to later accounts, felt harsh even to some who supported him. He was said to have distrusted the nobles and generals with long ties to Huayna Capac's northern campaigns. He demanded renewed oaths, punished those he suspected of divided loyalties, tightened his grip on ritual and ceremony. Atahualpa, in the north, did something much simpler, but no less powerful. He stood still and let people choose. Generals who had fought under Huayna Capac's banners in the northern wars looked at the man in Cusco and the man beside them, at the boy they had seen grow into a commander, and many of them decided that their loyalty ran along the roads they had marched, not just the stones of the capital. Soon, words were no longer enough. Envoys were replaced by armies. The empire turned its gaze inward. The same roads that had once allowed swift deployment against distant enemies now carried columns of warriors toward other columns of warriors who wore the same style of armor, spoke the same language, swore by the same sun. The same storehouses that had fed campaigns of expansion now fed forces marching to fight their own kin. From a distance on a map it might look like a simple contest between north and south, between two princes with competing claims. On the ground it was much messier. Some regions, especially in the north, threw themselves firmly behind Atahualpa. Others, rooted in long ties to Cusco and its rituals, lined up behind Huascar. Some tried to delay, to hedge, to keep 1 foot on each side of the line as long as possible, hoping to see which way the wind would finally blow. For ordinary communities, the cost was immediate and heavy. The mitae, the labour drafts that once built terraces and canals, were now increasingly called upon to support armies. Young men who might have spent a season on a bridge or in a quarry were marched off to military camps. Fields at home waited for hands that did not come. Pack trains of llamas that might have carried maize to fill provincial granaries hauled provisions toward camps where strategists argued over how to defeat other Inca generals. Battles unfolded along rivers and in high passes, leaving behind not the ruins of foreign enemies, but the broken bodies of imperial subjects. The energy that had once pushed the frontier outward now pulsed back and forth across the spine of the Andes, burning itself up in clashes that decided nothing final for months and then years. In theory, the structure of the empire was still there. The sun still rose over Cusco's temples. Runners still pounded along the roads. Taxes were still assessed. Ritual festivals still took place. In reality, much of that energy bent toward the question of which man could claim to embody the state. Each victory and defeat in the Civil War was not just a military event. It was a signal that rippled outward through the hierarchy. A governor in a distant valley would hear that Atahualpa's generals had crushed Huascar's forces in one engagement, and he might quietly lean northward, sending his next levy of soldiers in that direction instead of toward Cusco. Then a rumour of a southern counterattack would arrive, and he might hesitate, hold back supplies, wait to see if this news was real or just another plume of dust on the horizon. Over time, these hesitations frayed the empire's coherence. It was not that the state suddenly became weak in every place. Its infrastructure did not fall to pieces overnight. The roads did not vanish. The storehouses did not crumble. Well-trained armies still marched, still fought ferociously when they met. But attention, that invisible resource that had once flowed outward in a relatively unified stream, was now split and tangled. When a frontier chieftain tested the limits of imperial oversight, there were fewer eyes watching. When a subject people remembered an old grievance and quietly withheld part of their labour, there was less capacity to notice and correct it. When a shipment of cloth or metal or maize went missing between way stations, officials were more concerned with who among them might be secretly favouring the wrong prince than with restoring the missing goods. Finally, after a series of brutal campaigns, the balance tipped. Atahualpa's forces, guided by experienced commanders like Chalcuchimac and Quizquiz, pushed south with determination. Battle after battle eroded Huasca's strength. Accounts speak of massacres, of captured nobles and officers executed to break the spine of resistance. Cities that had sided with Cusco were punished with a severity meant to warn others. Huascar himself was eventually captured. For a moment in the northern camp, it might have seemed as if the crisis was over. One rival prince in chains, his supporters scattered or dead, the other victorious, surrounded by loyal generals and hardened soldiers. The pattern the empire had relied on in earlier disputes, struggle, then a single victor emerging to be acknowledged, seemed about to repeat itself. But this time, victory did not bring immediate healing. The cost of the civil war had been more than the loss of one faction's leadership. It had seeped into the bones of the state. Entire noble lineages had been decimated on one side or the other. Experienced administrators who had known how to balance local interests against imperial demands were gone, replaced by younger men whose main credential was having picked the right prince at the right moment. Regions that had backed Huascar had been traumatized, their elites humiliated, their people forced to supply the armies that had defeated them. Even in territories that now declared for Atahualpa, the memory of recent bloodshed hung thick. A governor who had watched his own family split over loyalties might obey the new order, but his trust was thinner, his willingness to take independent initiative smaller. A cuirassier forced to send his sons to fight fellow subjects might submit when Atahualpa's representatives arrived, but he would remember every corpse the war had left along local roads. Perhaps most dangerously, the very tools that had once held the empire together, fear and favour, movement of people, swift punishment of dissent, had just been used on a massive scale against parts of the empire itself. Subjects had seen whole cities treated like rebellious provinces, not because they were outside the imperial order, but because they had chosen the losing branch of it. That knowledge did not vanish when Atahualpa celebrated his victories. It lingered, a sharp awareness that loyalty could be rewarded one decade and annihilated the next. So, when Atahualpa emerged triumphant in the north, preparing to move south and take full possession of Cusco, he did not inherit the same kind of empire his father had ruled. He stood at the head of legions that were battle-tested but tired, in a realm whose administrators were overextended, whose storehouses had been drawn down, whose population bore fresh scars. The road still stretched in all directions, yes. The quippers still recorded quotas and obligations, the ceremony still invoked the sun. But much of the empire's energy was turned inward, toward consolidating a victory that was not yet fully secure, toward watching resentful regions, toward guarding high-status prisoners like Huasca and his kin. From the outside, to anyone approaching from beyond the last frontier, the Inca state might still have looked imposing, even invincible. Its armies had just proved themselves capable of destroying each other on a staggering scale. Its rulers had shown they would stop at nothing to resolve a succession dispute. It was not a ruined empire. It was something in some ways more perilous. A powerful one, distracted at the exact moment when strangers were stepping onto its shores, carrying with them forces the Andes had never seen. While Atahualpa listened to reports from his generals and weighed how to stage his entry into Cusco, something else, silent and unseen, was already moving along those same roads, into those same valleys, changing the balance of the story before he or his enemies fully understood what was happening. It had started years earlier, before Atahualpa and Huascar had turned their faces against each other, before Spanish words were being puzzled over in any Andean court. It began with strangers landing not on the shores of the Inca world, but far away to the north and east, where different peoples fished different coasts and built towns unfamiliar to Cusco's officials. Small groups of Europeans had been moving around the Caribbean and mainland shores for decades, trading, raiding, founding fragile colonies, tearing down some indigenous powers and making uneasy alliances with others. With them came something they did not plan, did not fully understand, and could not have stopped even if they had wanted to. Diseases moved with their bodies and breath, illnesses that had circulated in Eurasia and parts of Africa for centuries, weaving themselves into the lives and deaths of cities that had lived with them for generations. To people in those older worlds, they were terrible, yes, but they were not always extraordinary. Many had been exposed since childhood. Many carried scars or some measure of resistance. In the Americas, for thousands of years, those particular sicknesses had been absent. The people there had lived with their own sets of diseases, their own rhythms of sickness and recovery, their own medicines and rituals for coaxing health back into a household. But smallpox, measles, and several other infections that Europeans carried in their blood and lungs were strangers to these lands. When they finally arrived, they were not announced with trumpets or banners. They slipped ashore inside the breath of a sailor, the crusted sores of an infected child, the cough of a servant. They rode in on rats and fleas, in dirty clothes and contaminated water, carried forward by contact, by hospitality, by trade. On one side of the encounter, no one yet understood the mechanisms of viruses or bacteria. On the other, no one had seen this kind of disease before. As Europeans moved along the coasts and up river valleys, as they pushed into the lands of powerful peoples in Mesoamerica and beyond, outbreaks flared. They burned through towns and alliances alike. Then, as survivors staggered to their feet and tried to rebuild, travellers, traders, messengers, refugees, warriors carried new invisible embers onward. Long before anyone holding a Spanish banner came within sight of the high Inca roads, those embers had likely leapt from one web of relationships into another. This is one of those places where the historian's voice has to step a little more carefully. We cannot follow the exact path of every cough and sore. There are no day-by-day reports from the Andes, no hospital logs that map the first cases in each valley. Much of what we think happened is reconstructed from scattered testimony, from the memories of chroniclers who wrote years later, from the patterns of other epidemics that rolled ahead of or alongside European expansion. But when you set those pieces together, a picture begins to take shape. Somewhere between the early 16th century and the moment when Spanish horsemen actually appeared on the edge of the Inca world, smallpox, or something very much like it, seems to have arrived first. Perhaps it moved slowly at first, from the Caribbean down through overland trade routes linking different indigenous polities, passed along by those who had survived earlier waves and were now carriers of something their bodies could tolerate but still transmit. Perhaps it raced faster, carried by desperate migrants fleeing collapsing regions, by captives taken southward, by emissaries trying to forge new alliances in a landscape already roiled by Spanish intrusion. Maps drawn long after the fact cannot show you those movements, but the logic of interconnected worlds can. The Americas were not a set of isolated islands of culture. Networks of exchange, kinship and ritual stretched across mountains and forests and rivers, linking peoples who had never seen a European but who were now, unknowingly, linked to European diseases. By the time those illnesses reached Andean altitudes, they had already proven their power elsewhere. When they hit, there was no quiet adjustment. Smallpox, as later accounts describe it in the Andes, struck hard. Fever, pain, eruptions on the skin, blindness for some of those who survived. Communities that had their own names and understandings for illness suddenly faced a sickness that did not fit familiar categories, that did not respond to the usual remedies, whose progression seemed both cruel and unpredictable. The Inca realm, with its roads and its messengers and its administrators, was built to move things quickly. Orders, news, people, goods. It was also, unintentionally, built to move disease. A runner might carry a quipu recording new labour quotas from Cusco to a distant governor, stopping at way stations, sharing food, sleeping in crowded lodgings. An official summoned to court might leave his home village healthy and arrive sniffling, only to fall ill in the capital, far from his own shrine and healers. Soldiers rotated through garrisons, shifting from one climate to another at the command of their superiors. The very efficiency that made the empire so formidable turned into a highway for something no one had planned for. Somewhere along one of those roads, or in one of those provincial centres, the disease that likely killed Huayna Capac and one of his heirs took root. Many later writers, some indigenous, some Spanish, speak of a great pestilence in the years just before Pizarro's men trudged into what the empire considered its northern fringes. They describe death on a wide scale, Royal mummies burned or buried to avoid contagion, nobles and commoners alike struck down, cities partially emptied. They are not precise about dates. Accounts conflict over exactly which year, exactly which town. The Andes are large. The empire was spread over terrains that do not lend themselves to neat, synchronized narratives. Yet there is a convergence around the idea of a devastating epidemic that preceded the Spaniards themselves. Its most visible political consequence, from the perspective of later chroniclers, was the death of the emperor and the prince who might have replaced him smoothly. But the effect did not stop there. Imagine the shock, not in an abstract state, but in households and villages. A curator who had been the linchpin of local order for decades might die within days. His successor, if he had named one clearly, might also be struck before the transition rituals were complete. A lineage that had always supplied ritual specialists might find half its elders gone, the memories of certain rites now trapped in a few overburdened minds. In a system that depended on continuity, on knowing who owed what, who mediated between community and crown, who kept the story straight. That kind of sudden loss was more than grief. It was disorientation. Demographic shock rippled outward. Fields went untilled not only because men were drafted off to war later, but because sickness had already thinned labour at crucial moments, or taken away the old woman who knew which terrace received which seed first, which ditch had to be cleared before the rains. Storehouses might still stand, but the people who knew the details of their inventories could be gone, their replacement guessing, approximating, hoping they did not misremember obligations when inspectors came. In some places, whole hamlets may have been reduced to a fraction of their former size. Survivors, frightened and hungry, may have moved toward larger centres in search of food and protection, or away from them in fear that dense settlements bred more sickness. Each decision shifted the map of who lived where and who answered to whom. From Cusco's point of view, these were not just human tragedies. They were challenges to the smooth execution of imperial routines. The state could, and did, respond. It had mechanisms for relocating populations, for appointing new local leaders, for redistributing labour when plagues or famine struck. But the scale of the epidemic appears to have pushed those mechanisms to extremes. Officials had to be moved quickly into roles they had not fully trained for. Younger men, promoted because all their seniors had died, might know the forms of loyalty but not the fine art of balancing imperial demand with local tolerance. Some would overreach, squeezing communities too hard to prove their dedication. Others would hold back, fearful of attracting notice in a time when so many posts were suddenly up for grabs. Meanwhile, out in the provinces, loyalties that had seemed stable began to tremble. A community that had long accepted Inca oversight might now ask itself uneasy questions. If the sun's son and his chosen heir could be carried off by an invisible sickness, what did that mean about the cosmic order that had underwritten the empire's claims? If the rituals in Cusco had failed to protect the emperor, how certain was it that those same rituals could guarantee good harvests far away? Religion is rarely abandoned overnight, and there is no sign that the Andean world simply rejected the sun or turned its back on old deities en masse. But uncertainty can erode the sharpness of obedience. Some Caracas, grieving their dead, might have muttered that perhaps the old local huacas, the sacred places and beings their ancestors had honoured before the Inca came, deserved more attention again. Some communities might have quietly revived rites that had been discouraged, just in case they had angered a power they could not afford to ignore. In a tightly organised empire, even small shifts in ritual emphasis could signal potential shifts in political allegiance. Then came the Civil War, layering human violence over biological catastrophe. By the time Atahualpa's victory seemed near, the empire's leadership had been hit by a double blow. First, an epidemic that stripped out key figures in the generations above him, then a fratricidal conflict that consumed many of his peers and potential rivals. The result was not just a shortage of emperors, but a thinner, more brittle elite. Councils that once had old men who remembered earlier conquests and crises now had many younger voices whose memories began with the epidemic and the war. Their experience of empire was not of steady expansion, but of loss and suspicion. Their instinct, when faced with new disruptions, might tilt more toward harsh control than toward the patient weaving of consensus. And outside those councils, in the web of conquered and incorporated peoples, the experience was harsher still. In some regions, the epidemic had first killed long-familiar local lords, then the empire, in mourning and disarray, had pushed new administrators upon them. Then competing factions of that empire had come demanding soldiers and supplies. Then new epidemic waves may have rolled through, following armies or emerging in weakened, stressed populations. Under those conditions, the meaning of Inca protection became harder to feel. Protection from what? From enemies at the borders? The borders felt far away, while sickness and war were in one's own streets. From famine. The storehouses might help in some years, but what about when those storehouses were feeding marching columns instead? From cosmic disorder. The skies and seasons had gone on turning, but the imperial line had snapped and frayed, emperors dropping into the void one after another. None of this meant the empire disappeared. Far from it. It still had enormous coercive power, enormous pulling power. But the bond between centre and periphery was under strain in ways that did not always show up in formal proclamations. Here too the evidence is patchy. We do not have neat reports from every valley saying, "Our loyalty weakened by 20% this decade." What we have are later memories of regions that seized chances to defect, to rebel, to renegotiate terms once Spaniards offered them a new set of bargains. We have Spanish accounts marvelling at how eagerly some subject peoples sided with them against the Inca. Those later choices were rooted, at least in part, in the years of disease and civil conflict that came before. By the time Pizarro and his men were trudging south with interpreters and friars in tow, they were not walking into the same empire that had once rolled steadily outward under Huayna Capac's firm hand. They were stepping into a realm where invisible enemies from across the sea had already gnawed at the fabric. They did not need to understand how smallpox worked to benefit from the fact that it had killed key leaders before they arrived. They did not need to plan for demographic collapse to arrive in districts where populations were already lower, labour reserves thinner, the shock of loss still raw. They did not create the civil war, but they walked into its aftermath, where the elite was diminished, expectations were unsettled, and many communities had recent bitter memories of how ruthlessly the empire could treat its own children. In the stories Europeans later told about their conquests, they often emphasized their courage, their skill, their courage in the face of overwhelming odds. They wrote less, or not at all, about the luck of timing that put them on the scene after years of biological and political upheaval they had barely witnessed. Yet it is hard to imagine the events at Cajamarca unfolding in quite the same way without those invisible enemies having passed through first. When Atahualpa agreed to meet the bearded strangers who had requested an audience, he did so as a man who had survived epidemic and civil war, who stood atop an empire still powerful but internally shaken. His generals commanded battle-hardened troops, but they did so in a realm where many local loyalties had been tested, and where death had already arrived once in a form no spear could touch. The stage was set, not only by ambition and steel, but by fevers and scars. The Spaniards would make their own choices, spring their own trap, but they would do so in a world those earlier, unseen arrivals had already changed. Francisco Pizarro did not look like the kind of man who could tilt an empire. He was in his 50s, older than most of the soldiers who followed him, weathered by sun and hunger and too many disappointments. He was not a grand noble, not a famous commander, not someone to whom history had seemed destined to hand a continent. He had been an illegitimate child, a swineherd in his youth, a man who had clawed his way up step by step in places where men died easily and were forgotten quickly. When he first heard rumours of a rich land to the south, it was not as a statesman calculating some grand strategy. It was as a hard-used adventurer listening to sailors and slavers mutter about gold ornaments, fine textiles, well-built towns along a distant coast. So much of what drove him was simple and blunt. The desire not to go back to obscurity, not to age into poverty, not to watch others grow rich on chances he had turned down. By the time Pizarro finally led a real thrust into the Andean world, he had already failed twice along that same coastline. 2 earlier expeditions had brought back almost nothing but sickness, shipwrecks, and near starvation. Men had deserted, partners had argued, governors had tried to pull the plug on what seemed like a money pit. Each time the dream of a southern empire shimmered and nearly dissolved. But Pizarro was stubborn in a way that looks, from a distance, like destiny, and up close, like someone who has no other plan. He crossed the Atlantic to Spain to plead his case directly at court, standing in halls where he was very much a minor man, and somehow won a royal agreement giving him authority over lands not yet conquered. He came back with paper power, titles, promises of future rewards, and the right to try again. What he did not have was an army. So when his small force finally began to push inland from the Pacific coast toward the highlands, it was small not because that was a clever strategic design, but because that was what he could gather. The number that later chroniclers would repeat with a kind of awe, around 168 men when they approached Cajamarca, was not the full size of his following at every point, but it gives a sense of scale. It was the kind of force that could raid, that could terrorize a coastal town, that could seize a ship. It was not, by any normal standard of the time, a proper army with which to challenge one of the largest states in the world. Behind that small number sat a particular set of desires. The men who rode with Pizarro were not, for the most part, salaried professionals of a centralized kingdom. They were individuals who had bought their own arms and horses, or borrowed money to do so. They carried debts as well as lances. In their minds, the Americas were not a patient, long-term investment for a distant crown. They were a place where one spectacular success might transform a life. Wealth for them was not an abstract flow of bullion back to Spain. It was the immediate heavy feel of gold and silver objects that could be melted down, divided into shares, turned into noble titles, estates, marriages into better families. Status meant not only being called Don, instead of simply by one's name, but being able to go home and have people listen when you spoke. Royal favour was something that could be bought with victories and loot, with letters describing new lands converted to Christianity, with tales of heathen idols smashed and churches razed. And underneath those ambitions lay something simpler: survival. To join a venture like Pizarro's was to step into a world where food was not guaranteed, where hostile shorelines might offer no harbour, where storms could break a mast in an hour, where unfamiliar landscapes hid enemies and diseases alike. There was a constant quiet calculation, the risk of dying unknown in some ravine, weighed against the chance of being one of those few whose names were written down and remembered. For most, there was no safe middle path back home. They had already gambled their modest inheritances or their borrowed capital. Turning back empty-handed could mean prison for debts, or a life of grinding poverty that would sting more sharply after having glimpsed the possibility of riches. This mix of motives shaped their methods. A small, hungry band cannot afford to behave like a large, slow-moving army. It cannot simply surround enemies with numbers and wait them out. It must move quickly, strike suddenly, and above all, avoid becoming trapped. Pizarro understood this from hard experience. He knew how close to the edge his company always was. On the coastal plains of northern Peru, before they began to climb, the Spaniards had already learned how thin their margin of safety could be. They depended on local food and water, on guides who might or might not be loyal, on interpreters who mediated not just language but meaning. A single bad decision could leave them stranded between hostile communities and an unforgiving ocean. Numbers mattered in the most basic way. If too many men died of disease or in skirmishes, there would not be enough left to keep discipline, guard the camp, care for the horses, or project the impression of strength that often mattered as much as strength itself. Under those conditions, Pizarro's options narrowed and sharpened. He could not take and hold large territories in any conventional sense. He could not fight pitched battles in open country against tens of thousands of well-organized warriors and hope to win simply by endurance. For him, the only viable path was to think in terms of leverage, how to create maximum political shock with minimal physical force. That is where diplomacy, deception, and audacity move from being interesting sidelines to being absolutely central. With so few men, he needed to make their presence seem larger than it was. He needed to appear to those watching from the Andean side not as a risky nuisance to be brushed away, but as a potential tool, or, failing that, as a strangely dangerous presence that could not be engaged on ordinary terms. Early encounters with local leaders along the coast gave him practice. Some communities resisted and were punished harshly to send a message. Others offered food and information, trying to redirect this unsettling new force against their own rivals. Each interaction was a negotiation layered with half-truths. Spaniards spoke of their distant king and his great power, of their god and the Pope's authority over unknown lands. Local chiefs tested them, sending small groups to observe their weapons, their horses, their behavior in camp. In this environment, every success had to be magnified, every hesitation hidden. When Spanish horsemen scattered a formation of warriors who had never seen such animals before, that moment did more than win a skirmish. It offered a story that could be retold up and down the valleys, of terrifying beasts that killed faster than human runners, of men in metal who seemed barely vulnerable to stone or wood. Pizarro understood the value of such stories. He needed fear and curiosity to run ahead of him, softening the ground before he arrived in person. Yet beneath this carefully crafted image lay a constant vulnerability. The Spaniards could not eat steel. Their horses required fodder. Their gunpowder could be spoiled by rain. Their bodies were as fragile to Andean weapons as any human flesh, if caught unarmoured, unprepared, or simply overwhelmed. In the highlands, the thin air and cold would press hard on them and on their animals, while local attackers would be at home. This contrast between how small and breakable they were and how recklessly they sometimes acted is one of the most striking things in the sources. When they heard that the Inca ruler himself, Atahualpa, was nearby with a huge army, they did not immediately turn back. They did not dig in and wait desperately for reinforcements that might never come. Instead, they walked toward the danger. Pizarro's gamble in its purest form was to treat that approach not as an impending disaster, but as an opportunity. He had spent years trying to find the heart of this rich land. Now he was being offered, in a sense, the heart delivered to him. A single man, even if he was the focus of immense power, was still a man. Pizarro had already seen, in the Caribbean and on the Isthmus of Panama, how the capture or death of a key indigenous leader could shock and disorient whole regions. In Mexico, the Spanish seizure of Moctezuma had been watched by outsiders like him with intense interest. There, a small force had managed to paralyze an empire, at least for a time, by striking at its symbolic core. He could not copy that script exactly. The circumstances, the cultures, the geography were different. But the underlying logic, hit the nerve center, and you might move the entire body, was too tempting to ignore. If he could lure Atahualpa into a position where the Spaniards held the advantage, even briefly he might do with 168 men what no counting of spears would suggest they could do. This was not a lone man imposing his wild plan on reluctant followers. Many of his companions, when they learned they were near the Inca camp, felt the same mixture of fear and fierce hope. Some argued for caution, others for immediate boldness, but almost all understood that turning back now might mean the end of their dreams. Supplies were finite. Patience in Panama and Spain was not endless, and each day they stayed in this land without a decisive gain increased the risk that the empire's rulers would simply crush them. What made their audacity remotely plausible was not just their own nerve and weapons, but the condition of the Inca world they were walking into. Those 168 men were not striding into Huayna Capaz's stable empire at its confident peak. They were arriving, as we have seen, after epidemic, after succession crisis, in the wake of a civil war that had pitted brother against brother and left scars in every province that had supplied troops or grain. The Inca forces gathering with Atahualpa were strong, disciplined, and experienced, but they were also part of a realm where many local loyalties had been recently rearranged, where some elites owed their current positions to Atahualpa's victory and feared any hint of reversal, while others resented his ascent. For Pizarro, even without understanding all these internal tensions in detail, there were hints. Interpreters and allies from coastal polities told him stories of harsh Inca rule, of people who might welcome any chance to weaken Cusco's grip. Messengers came and went bearing gifts, testing him as much as honouring him. He could see that this was not a united wall of hostility, but a world of factions and grievances. The gamble, then, was not just military. It was political and psychological. Pizarro was betting that if he could seize the emperor, the shock would ripple outward through an already strained system. He was betting that some subject lords would hesitate rather than hurl themselves into a fight that might destroy them alongside the strangers. He was betting that fear, confusion, and opportunity-seeking would work in his favour. And underneath all of that, he was betting on time, that he and his men could survive long enough, after any such strike, to turn that initial shock into new alliances and flows of tribute before a counterattack crushed them. Conquest, in his mind, was not a single battle to be won, but a chain of improvisations, each dependent on the last. With this in mind, the road toward Cajamarca was not just a march toward an enemy camp. It was the narrowing corridor of a chosen risk, the point at which turning back became less possible than moving forward. Between the small Spanish campfires at night and the flickering watchfires of the Inca army on distant ridges lay a gap of numbers that courage alone could not close. Pizarro's answer was to try something so unexpected that numbers, for a moment, might matter less than surprise. To turn surprise into anything more than a brief advantage, Pizarro needed tools that could change what a first encounter felt like. He did not have many of those tools in absolute terms, but the ones he did have were unusual enough in the Andean world and loud enough and fast enough that they could make a crowd of observers forget for a few moments how few Spaniards there actually were. Some of those tools were alive. The horse, for people raised among them, was a familiar partner in war and work. In Castile or Extremadura, a mounted man was not a monster. He was a figure one could recognize from childhood stories and dusty training yards. You learned how a horse moved, what it was likely to shy at, how to stay in the saddle when it stumbled. You understood that under the iron-shod hooves and the animal's bulk there was muscle and bone that could break, that needed feeding and rest. In the highlands of the Inca realm, horses were not simply unfamiliar. They were outside the categories people used to think about animals and movement. There were fast animals in Andean life, the lithe bodies of wild deer, the darting grace of birds, the long-legged stride of runners who could carry a knotted cord of orders from one town to the next. There were strong animals too, particularly the camelids that bore burdens along the roads, llamas and alpacas, steady, deliberate, spitting when annoyed, stopping when overloaded. But nothing combined speed and weight, and the capacity to be directed by a human on its back, in the way a horse did. When Inca scouts first saw a few Spaniards gallop, the reports they carried back were attempts to describe something that, by its nature, resisted ordinary description. Men seemed fused with beasts, moving faster than a man could run and then, without pausing, turning and charging again. Hooves crushed bodies in a way that no human foot could. Lances couched under arms reached out beyond the length of a spear. For those who had never watched cavalry before, the first lesson was not about tactics. It was more basic. This is possible. Pizarro did not have many horses. Dozens, not hundreds. Some had been lost on earlier coastal marches. Some would weaken in the thin air as they climbed toward Cajamarca. To European eyes, this was a small, fragile cavalry force that in open country could easily have been surrounded. But in a narrow street, a courtyard, or a tightly packed crowd, each horse could be a moving wedge, a source of panic disproportionate to its number. The animal's sheer size, combined with the shouting of its rider and the flash of steel, could turn an orderly formation into a fraying mass of individuals trying not to be under those hooves. Alongside the horses came weapons that could cut and pierce in ways Andean fighters had rarely seen. The Inca and their neighbours were not strangers to metal. They worked gold, silver and copper skillfully. They used bronze for tools and ceremonial objects. Their warriors were practised with clubs, slings, spears and axes. A stone from a well-handled sling could crack bone at a surprising distance. A heavy mace could shatter a helmet. They knew about sharp edges and blunt force. What they had not met in significant numbers before were men encased in layers of steel and hardened leather, carrying blades of high-quality iron that kept a narrow, keen edge. A Spanish sword was not magic. In a press of bodies it could be knocked from a hand. An unarmoured leg or arm could be cut by a well-swung Andean weapon just as surely as by any other. But again, the differences showed themselves in first impressions, in the way the first clash of weapons sounded and felt. A slingstone ringing off a steel helmet makes a different noise than one striking padded cloth or bare bone. It might still stagger the man underneath. It might still break his nose through the visor or rattle his teeth. But when he does not fall, when he keeps moving forward with blood on his lip and sword in his hand, something important happens in the minds of those watching. An expectation, hit him there and he will go down, is quietly undermined. Likewise, when a sword thrust pierces armour or padded tunic more easily than a stone-tipped spear, it can change the rhythm of a close fight. A cut that severs fingers gripping a shield, a stab that slides between ribs where a wooden or bone weapon might splinter, leaves stories in its wake. Those stories travel. They arrive ahead of the next confrontation, decorating it with rumours of invulnerable men and weapons that cut through anything. Guns, in this world, were still uncertain instruments even for the Spaniards. The matchlock arquebuses they carried were heavy, slow to reload, and vulnerable to dampness. Powder could be spoiled by one sudden downpour. Misfires were common. In a long sustained battle their limitations would show quickly, but in the brief space of an ambush or a ceremony turned violent, those weaknesses barely mattered. What mattered was the first shot. A gunshot is both sound and shock. The hot flash at the muzzle, the puff of smoke, the sharp, cracking report that echoes off stone walls, and then, almost at the same moment, a man in an embroidered cloak falling backward with a hole in his chest. For people who have only ever heard thunder from the sky, who know loud sounds as the rumble of earth movement, the sudden proximity of that noise, wrapped around a visible killing, is not just frightening. It scrambles the senses. Some Inca and their allies would have had hints already. Earlier skirmishes on the coast, or news from farther north, might have mentioned thunder tubes or sticks that spat fire. But even with warning, the human body responds to such a sound with a jolt. Horses rear, children cry, adults flinch. That fraction of a heartbeat when a man raises his arm to shield his face, even though there is nothing physical coming toward it, can decide whether he holds his ground or turns away. And then there is the smoke. Black powder fogs the air in confined spaces, stinging eyes, thickening breaths. It is not instantly deadly. It is an irritant, a blinding veil. In a square, in a courtyard, the smoke of even a handful of guns can make it harder to see where the attack is coming from. For Spaniards who had drilled, however roughly, with these weapons and watched them on European fields, that was a familiar nuisance. For nobles and attendants crowding around an emperor's litter in a place they thought safe, it could make the very air feel hostile. Armour for the Spaniards was both protection and symbol. Breastplates, helmets, metal collars, and pieces of mail were expensive. Not every man in Pizarro's band wore full plate. Many mixed bits of steel with hardened leather and quilted fabric. Some had only simple helmets and a few metal plates sewn into their jackets. Yet even partial armour created a visible difference, a kind of metallic carapace that caught the sun and suggested hardness. Against clubs and stones that hardness had limits. A blow to the joints, to the back of the knee, to the unprotected limb could disable a man in armour as it would any other. A slingstone striking a visor at the right angle could still penetrate or deform metal. The Spaniards were not walking tanks. But when those first exchanges of blows went in their favour, when men in helmets took hits and did not die, The armour's psychological thickness increased. The next time an Andean fighter chose where to aim, doubt might creep into his movement. Pizarro and his companions understood, at least in a rough way, how these substances and animals and noises appeared from the other side. They had, in their own earlier lives, been startled by new forms of violence. The first time one sees artillery, the first time one hears a gun, the first time a packed line of men faces down a cavalry charge. They knew that the gap between hearing of such things and meeting them in person can be wide. They leaned into that gap. Yet it would be misleading to treat steel and horses and guns as if they were a kind of simple code that explains everything. The Inca and their allies were not paralyzed by superstition at the sight of a horse. They adapted. There are records, soon after the first clashes, of Andean warriors learning to grab at reins, to strike at horses' legs, to use terrain that limited the animal's speed. They shifted their formations, experimented with pits and obstacles, learned that a man could be pulled from his saddle. Human minds, on every side, learned quickly under pressure. What made the Spaniards' technological edges decisive in certain moments was not their inherent superiority in every circumstance. It was the way those edges intersected with surprise, with misunderstanding, with the particular settings in which meetings occurred. A few mounted men, erupting suddenly into a plaza crowded with courtiers and servants who had not come armed for a battlefield, could create chaos far beyond the measure of hoofbeats on stone. A handful of arquebuses, fired at near point-blank range into a tight mass of high-ranking figures, could send a message sharper than any bullet. The routines of safety you rely on no longer hold. Noise in these encounters was not just an accidental byproduct. The clatter of hooves on flagstones, the clanging of weapons on armour, the Spanish shouts combining with the screams of the first wounded, these layered sounds, layered meanings as well. To one listener, it was an assault by demons. To another, it was an abrupt shift from ceremony to slaughter. To the Spaniards themselves, it was in some sense familiar. The din that said a gamble was now in motion and could not easily be reversed. Speed mattered in similar ways, not just the physical speed of horses or of drawn swords, but the speed with which a situation turned. The Inca world prized order, sequence, protocol. Meetings between great figures were choreographed, their steps and pauses loaded with meaning. Pizarro's plan, supported by his few tools of metal and horseflesh and powder, was to break that choreography, to compress hours of careful negotiation into minutes of violence, before the vastly superior numbers outside any given square could react in a coordinated way. If gunpowder had been wet that day, if horses had stumbled badly on the way into Cajamarca, if a breastplate buckle had failed at the wrong instant, some of the sharpness of that turn might have dulled. The same technologies that amplified Spanish force could, under different weather or in different spaces, have looked clumsy and inadequate. Context framed every advantage. An arquebus is formidable at 20 paces in a panic-stricken crowd. It is far less so across a windy field against archers on higher ground. A horse is terrifying in a narrow alley. It can be trapped and killed in a ravine. In the days leading up to Cajamarca, as messengers passed between Pizarro's camp and Atahualpa's, each side weighed not only words but images. The Inca envoys saw the Spaniards' armour, the way their horses responded to slight movements of reins, the composed manner with which they handled their strange weapons. The Spaniards glimpsed Inca discipline, the neat ranks of warriors on distant hills, the glitter of fine textiles and metal ornaments. Behind the formal messages, assurances of peace, invocations of friendship, ran silent calculations about what might happen if words failed. Out of those calculations, and the limited but vivid tools at his disposal, Pizarro shaped the outline of his trap. He did not have enough men to meet Atahualpa's thousands on open ground and simply test whose weapons cut more deeply. He did have enough, if everything went right, to turn steel and horses and the crack of a few guns into a storm that would, for a brief and awful interval, matter more than numbers. The road into Cajamarca, then, was not just a path between ravines and over-cold streams. It was a narrowing tunnel through which the Spaniards carried their noisy, shining, smoke-belching advantages, hoping that when they finally stepped into the wide, paved square where the Emperor waited, all those edges would collide with surprise in the precise way they needed. The road into Cajamarca had not always pointed toward disaster. At first, it was simply another Andean route, one of many stone-lined paths that climbed and dipped with the contours of the land. Llamas had trodden it for years, their soft feet scuffing dust to the sides. Messengers had run it, lungs burning in the cold air, carrying knotted cords and memorized phrases. When the Spaniards turned their faces inland and began to follow it, they were entering a world that already knew how to organize movement, how to send information ahead, how to watch. They did not march blind. From the coast to the highlands, Pizarro's band fed on more than roasted corn and dried meat. They fed on stories. Some came through interpreters whose words stretched across 3 or 4 languages, like fragile bridges over rushing water. A phrase would leave a Spaniard's mouth in Castilian, pass through a man who spoke Spanish and an indigenous coastal tongue, then into another who knew that tongue and a variant of Quechua, and finally emerge in the speech of some highland lord. On the way, meanings shifted. Threats became suggestions. Boasts turned into polite statements. Questions picked up new shades of implication. Other stories came from people who had very clear reasons to talk. Not everyone under Inca rule was content. Some local chiefs saw in these bearded strangers a possible lever against Cusco's power, or against whichever side in the civil war had crushed their family. They offered guides, porters, food, and, more valuable than any of those, information. They told the Spaniards about storehouses filled with grain, about the roads that branched and the passes that narrowed, about which valleys belonged to which lords. Pizarro listened. So did his captains. They were not scholars of Andean politics, but they had spent their lives weighing rumour against risk. When a chief said that Atahualpa was nearby with a vast army, that the emperor had just defeated his brother and now ruled unchallenged in the north, they believed at least the outline. When another whispered that many resented the new ruler, that rivals and their followers had been killed or humiliated, they heard possibility. They also watched with their own eyes. As the band climbed higher, the evidence of a powerful state surrounded them. Roads too well made to be the work of scattered villages, terraces clinging to steep slopes green with crops, canals leading water just where it was needed. On distant ridges, dark lines that resolved themselves into ranks of warriors, spears upright, shields gleaming. This was not the trail of scattered tribes the Spaniards had known in some parts of the Caribbean. It was an organized landscape tight with meaning and authority. News moved along those ridges faster than horses could canter. Inca messengers, lean and trained from youth, could cover distances in a day that would have taken a loaded Spanish column much longer. Each time Pizarro's men passed a village, there were watchers who noted their numbers, their weapons, the way their horses stepped. By the time word reached Atahualpa in the town of Cajamarca, it had been filtered through many sets of eyes, many tongues, many expectations. Still, the core was probably clear enough. A small band of strange men was coming, with animals unlike any seen before and weapons that made thunder. Atahualpa did not receive this news as a man anxious for his throne. He had already won his throne with blood. The civil war with his brother Huascar had been harsh, a conflict not only of armies but of visions of control. Atahualpa's generals had crushed Huascar's forces in battle after battle. Noble captives had been bound, paraded, executed. Messages sent out from the victor's camp spoke of legitimacy, of the gods' favour made visible in victory. The emperor who waited at Cajamarca was a man at the height of his self-belief. He had thousands of warriors around him, commanded by seasoned captains who had just proved their skill in the most serious test a state can face, a war against itself. He controlled the heartlands of the north, the central arteries of communication, the flow of tribute. If there were pockets of resistance, they were scattered, disarmed, or in hiding. Against that backdrop, the arrival of fewer than 200 foreigners, even unsettling ones, did not necessarily look like the opening act of catastrophe. It might have seemed more like a curiosity, a test, or at most a nuisance that could be managed. There were reasons, too, for Atahualpa to see advantage in treating with the strangers, rather than simply sweeping them away. Rumours about them had been seeping into the empire for years. Tales of pale men on the coast, of metal that cut deeply, of diseases that seemed to precede their full arrival. Some of those tales exaggerated Spanish power, turning them into almost legendary figures. Others emphasized their small numbers and the ease with which they could be killed once one understood their weaknesses. In that swirl, the emperor may have seen an opportunity. If these men brought access to exotic goods, or could be bent into service as another client group, they might be useful. If they were dangerous, better to draw them in where they could be observed, measured, perhaps humbled publicly. Cajamarca itself was a fitting stage for such measurement. It was a highland town with hot springs that made it a pleasing resting place, but it was also a node in the road system, a point where routes converged. From there, Atahualpa could send out commands in several directions at once. The surrounding hills offered good ground for encampments. The central square, paved, broad, wrapped by buildings, was a place designed for gatherings, proclamations, ritual displays of power. It was neither his capital nor his most sacred city, which made it an acceptable place for a first meeting with uncertain visitors. If things went badly, the damage to symbolic centres would be limited. If things went well, the square of Cajamarca could become the backdrop for a story of imperial magnanimity and control. Pizarro, for his part, looked at the same town and saw something else. A box with stone sides. Enclosed spaces comforted him in a way open fields did not. Within walls, the enemy's numerical advantage could be cut to something his small band might manage. The square had multiple entrances that could be blocked or used for sudden charges. It had roofs and rooms from which men could fire or leap down. It had crucially the appearance of safety, a place where an emperor might enter unarmoured, lifted high on a litter, thinking in terms of ceremony rather than battle. Between the two parties, messages began to move. Envoys came from Atahualpa to Pizarro, accompanied by attendants carrying gifts and questions. Some brought fine textiles, others food and drink, symbols of hospitality that also expressed rank. They looked at the Spaniards, counted their horses, examined their weapons with eyes that tried to fit them into familiar categories. Were these men just another group of northern barbarians, oddly equipped, but essentially like others the Inca had subdued? Were they emissaries of some distant lord? The envoy's training inclined them toward interpretation through analogy, to understand the new by comparing it to the known. The Spaniards were doing the same. They watched the envoy's bearing, the obedience of their attendants, the easy assumption with which they spoke on behalf of a ruler miles away. To men who had grown up in the shadow of European courts, this looked like a version of what they recognized, a hierarchical state used to ritual and obedience. They knew how to exploit such structures. In Europe, seizing or influencing a king could sometimes mean bending a nation. They reasoned that something similar might apply here, but beneath those surface similarities ran deep differences in how power was expressed and how meetings between high figures unfolded. Inca political culture wrapped authority in layers of ritual. When a great lord travelled, his approach was marked by stages, scouts first, then officials, then the person himself, embedded in ceremony. The moment of encounter was as much about reaffirming cosmic order as about negotiating practical terms. Everyone present was expected to know the script: who bowed, who spoke first, who remained silent. The Spaniards had their own rituals, banners raised, oaths sworn, formal proclamations read in languages the locals did not understand, but they were increasingly willing to discard or twist those if doing so gave them an edge. Pizarro's plan for Cajamarca was not to meet Atahualpa within a shared script, but to shatter the script at the moment it seemed most solid. He imagined the emperor arriving in state, surrounded by ranks of unarmed attendants and guards who had left their weapons behind out of respect. He imagined Spanish steel and horses bursting into that scene like a storm cutting through a festival. In the days just before the meeting, misreading piled on misreading. Atahualpa sent word that the Spaniards should lodge in Cajamarca, that there would be a meeting there. To him, such an invitation from a position of strength may have signalled confidence and perhaps mercy. He was giving the strangers a chance to present themselves properly, to accept his status, to become, in effect, manageable elements within his world. To the Spaniards, the same message confirmed that the emperor would come to them, into a town they could reconnoitre and prepare. It was, in their eyes, an opening, not a command. When an envoy reported back to Atahualpa that the Spaniards had few men but strange courage, that they had demanded the emperor visit them, that they had shown no fear in the face of the Inca army, the report could be read in multiple ways, as insolence, yes, as ignorance of their position, but also possibly as an odd kind of bravery or folly that did not warrant immediate extermination. An overwhelmingly superior force does not always crush a smaller one at first sight. Sometimes it toys with it, tests it, seeks to understand it. For Atahualpa, recently victorious, conscious of his own importance, it may have seemed fitting to confront these intruders personally, to let them see him in his majesty, and to decide in his own time whether to absorb them, use them, or cast them aside. Meanwhile, inside Cajamarca, the Spaniards moved through empty streets with a different feeling in their chests. They noticed how quickly the town could be isolated, how the approaches narrowed, how buildings overlooked the square. They chose quarters, arranged their horses, positioned their few guns. At night, they talked in low voices about numbers, about whether the emperor would come with 10,000, 20,000 more. Some argued for retreat, for slipping away into the hills before the noose tightened completely. Others argued that there would never be a better opportunity. The emperor, unarmoured, within reach, in a place where their few strengths could matter. Each side in its own camp was preparing for a meeting. Each imagined the centre of that meeting very differently. For Atahualpa, it was a stage on which his dominance would be enacted, a place where foreign men would bow, where gifts would be exchanged, where his words would set the terms of whatever relationship followed. For Pizarro, it was not really a meeting at all. It was a moment to strike, a brief interval when the emperor would be close enough, visible enough, surrounded by just enough confusion that a handful of men could reach him. As the appointed day drew near, the road between the emperor's camp and the town filled with movement. Columns of attendants carrying litters and banners, musicians, lines of nobles in embroidered garments, ranks of warriors whose weapons might or might not follow them all the way into the square. Dust rose under their feet. Above them, the mountains watched as they had watched other armies come and go. In Cajamarca, horses were saddled early. Armour straps were checked and rechecked. Powder was kept as dry as men could manage. Pizarro walked the edges of the square, counting paces, imagining where his men would be hidden, where they would run. At some point both parties slept, if sleep was possible. Dreams, if they came, would have been coloured by victory for one, by gamble for the other. Between those dreams the distance was closing. A road that had once merely joined one Andean town to another had become, through a chain of decisions and misunderstandings, the path that would bring an emperor into a stone-walled space where the old rules would not hold. The next steps would be taken in daylight, under many watching eyes, in a square that had seen rituals of greeting before, but never anything quite like what was coming. The morning of the meeting dawned thin and bright over Cajamarca. The air at that altitude was sharp, making breath visible in short puffs. In the fields beyond the town, tens of thousands of Inca warriors and attendants stirred, tending fires, tightening sandals, checking the straps of litters. Closer in, around the hot springs where Atahualpa had made his camp, the preparations took on a different quality. This was not the bustle of an army readying for battle. It was the choreography of a court preparing for display. For Atahualpa, the day seems to have been framed in his mind less as a risk than as an opportunity to demonstrate control. He bathed in the springs, as emperors and great lords did, letting the warmth soak into muscles that had spent months in the rigours of campaign. Attendants brought cloth of exquisite weave, heavy with prestige. He was dressed in garments that were themselves statements, of the regions that paid him tribute, of the gods whose favour he claimed. On his head, a fringe signalled his status so clearly that no one along the route would have any doubt who passed. Around him clustered nobles, generals, priests, and chosen attendants. They knew their positions, the distances at which they should walk, the angle at which they should bear their gaze. Somewhere in those ranks, commanders discussed how many warriors should follow the emperor toward Cajamarca, and how close their weapons should be allowed to the sacred centre of a meeting. Tradition suggested that to approach an honoured guest entirely bristling with arms could be a kind of insult, a denial of trust. Power in Inca ritual did not always announce itself with spears at the ready. Often, it was more impressive to demonstrate such confidence that one could arrive crowned and unarmoured. Out beyond that inner ring of ceremony, though, lay the reality of force. Some sources suggest there were as many as 40,000 Inca warriors in the broader camp, perhaps more if you count porters and support personnel. Even allowing for exaggeration, the numbers were huge. The emperor could, in theory, have marched on Cajamarca with an overwhelming tide of armed men. Instead, he chose a smaller, more carefully curated procession to enter the town. Back inside Cajamarca's square, the mood was altogether different. The Spaniards moved through the chilly air in layers of linen and metal, tightening straps, checking edges. Pizarro had spent the night before walking the perimeter of the plaza, reviewing his plan aloud to captains who had ridden with him through other desperate gambles. He divided his meagre force among the stone buildings that ring the square. Cavalry in some, infantry and crossbowmen in others, a cannon or two positioned where their mouths could be thrust out at the last moment. The horses were kept in shadowed courtyards, bridles ready, saddles in place, nostrils flaring at the unfamiliar stillness. Men were told to stay quiet, to keep armour from clinking, to sit on blankets so that boots would not scrape stone. The square itself was left almost empty. A few Spaniards moved visibly, as if they were simply waiting, weapons at their sides but not in hand. The emptiness was a lure. To anyone coming in, it would suggest that the visitors were few, that they were on display, that the space was open and harmless. Above and behind that impression, in upper rooms and behind thick walls, nearly every armed man Pizarro had was coiled, listening for a signal. There was one more figure essential to the plan, though his role was framed, at least on the surface, in spiritual terms. Friar Vicente de Valverde, a Dominican, had been chosen to lead the formal approach to Atahualpa. He wore the robes of his office, carried a cross, and had with him a book, whether a breviary, a Bible, or another liturgical text. The sources differ. What is consistent is the idea that this book, and the words he would read from it, would form part of the strange negotiation about to unfold. As the day moved on and shadows shortened, the road from the emperor's camp began to fill. At first, scouts and lesser attendants, then the more carefully ordered ranks of nobility and retainers, music, banners, plumes. In the distance, the procession must have looked like a moving tapestry, bands of colour and motion against the earth-toned slopes. Some warriors marched with the emperor, but not in dense combat formation. Many accounts suggest that only a portion of his armed strength approached the town itself, perhaps 1,500 or so close by, with the bulk of his forces remaining in camp or on nearby heights. Accounts differ on whether those who entered the square were allowed to carry their usual weapons or only ceremonial ones. What most agree on is that Atahualpa himself approached in full regalia, borne aloft on a litter of great richness, surrounded by high-ranking figures on their own litters or on foot, and by unarmed or lightly armed attendants. From his vantage point, elevated and ringed in obedience, the empty square of Cajamarca did not necessarily look like a trap. It looked like a stage, cleared for his arrival. The absence of dense crowds might even have read as deference, space made so that His Majesty would be unobstructed. Stone buildings around the edges, the plaza itself open, a handful of strange men waiting in one corner. The Emperor, used to being the still centre of a moving world, advanced. At some point as the procession entered the town, Pizarro gave the order for the concealed Spaniards to hold their positions and keep out of sight. The sound of the approaching Andean court grew louder. Flutes, drums, sandals on stone, voices calling out ritual phrases. Dust and music drifted into the square ahead of the columns of people. When Atahualpa's litter and the forward part of his entourage reached the open centre, the choreography shifted. Friar Valverde, accompanied by an interpreter and a small guard, walked out from the Spanish position toward the emperor's raised platform. In that moment, two very different ritual worlds met. The friar, in his own understanding, was there to perform an act that was both legal and spiritual. He would present the authority of the Christian God, the power of the Pope and the King of Spain, and demand that Atahualpa accept them. This framework was, in Spanish eyes, a necessary precursor to legitimate conquest. Even if no one on the other side understood the words, the act would have been carried out. Through the interpreter, or through a chain of interpreters depending on how exactly language moved that day, Valverde spoke at length. He talked of one God, of creation, of authority granted to St. Peter, and then to popes, of the king who ruled by that permission. He asked, in effect, that Atahualpa acknowledge this God, accept the church, and submit to the King of Spain as a vassal. For an emperor whose own authority was wrapped in divine sanction from very different sources, the speech would have been at best baffling. The idea that a book could speak, that written words carried law from another world, did not map neatly onto Andean ways of fixing memory and legitimacy. Some versions of the story say that when the friar handed the book to Atahualpa, the emperor held it to his ear, heard nothing and tossed it aside. Others suggest he handled it briefly with indifference or disdain, then let it fall. On the Spanish side, later chroniclers made much of this gesture. They described it as sacrilege, an insult to the sacred text and to God. In some tellings, this becomes the spark of righteous anger, the moment when patience snapped. But even if that was how it was later framed, the violence that followed was unlikely to have been improvised. Pizarro had brought his men here specifically to strike during the meeting. The friar's report, that Atahualpa refused submission, that he had rejected the book, was the cue that the time had come. On the Inca side, whatever Atahualpa did with the book may have held a different meaning. Tossing aside an incomprehensible object, or signalling displeasure at an overbold speech, did not necessarily register as a declaration of war. The emperor was in the centre of his own performance, confident enough to brush off what seemed like the presumptions of a tiny foreign band. Into that gap in understanding, the trap snapped shut. Friar Valverde is said to have turned back toward the Spanish position, calling for them to attack. A prearranged signal, perhaps a shot from a small cannon, perhaps a shouted word, perhaps simply seeing the friar retreat, triggered motion in the buildings around the square. Doors flew open. The stillness in those stone walls burst into chaos. From three sides, armoured men on horseback erupted into the open space, spurs striking flanks, lances levelled. To those in the square who had never seen a horse before these months, the spectacle was something out of nightmare. Animals taller than a man snorting, metal flashing from their riders, the two forms moving as one. Their hooves thundered on stone, echoing off high walls, amplifying the impression of numbers and weight. Behind and between the cavalry came Spanish infantry, swords drawn, some with shields, others with crossbows or early firearms. A cannon roared, whether loaded with shot or simply powder to shock and terrify. The sound alone, contained and thrown back by the surrounding buildings, would have been stunning. Smoke rolled over the square, the smell of sulphur mixing with dust and the sharp scent of sweat and fear. For the Inca attendants closest to the emperor, the transformation of the scene must have been almost impossible to process at first. One moment, they stood in a ritual centre, secure in the presence of their ruler and the prestige of his retinue. The next, an empty side of the square vomited forth metal-clad men on animals that trampled whoever stood in their path. In such a rush, numerical advantage can turn into a liability. The very density of people around Atahualpa made it hard to move, to form coherent defensive lines, to get clear instructions from commanders to the men who might carry them out. Panic moves faster than orders. Cries of alarm, the crack of unfamiliar weapons, bodies falling, each of these fed a rising sense that the script had been torn up and that no one knew the new lines. Some Inca warriors attempted to respond. Those who had weapons raised them, tried to interpose themselves between the Spaniards and their emperor. There are accounts of men reaching for the legs of horses, trying to drag them down, or throwing themselves bodily toward the riders. Others tried to lift their lord's litter higher to keep him above the chaos. In the crush, many were simply unable to move at all. The Spaniards, for their part, had been instructed with a clear priority: reach Atahualpa. Everything about the attack was shaped around that goal. The cavalry charges were intended to slice into the mass of attendants, to create openings and terror. Infantry followed those slashes, pushing through gaps, hacking and stabbing at anyone who resisted. The sound of metal on flesh, of men shouting in languages neither side fully understood, rose into a single, overwhelming roar. Around the edges of the square, those who might have been able to organize a counterattack struggled against the very structure of the procession. High nobles, carried on their own litters or hemmed in by attendants, were suddenly trapped. To send orders back out toward the larger Inca force beyond the town required messengers who could slip through tightening rings of violence. Many never made it. In that first brutal interval, the Spanish advantage was not in numbers, or even solely in their weapons, but in focus. Nearly every movement they made was oriented toward narrowing the distance between themselves and one man in the centre. They cut at bearers, slashed at arms reaching for them, drove their horses toward the spot where they could see the emperor's elevated form above the crowd. Accounts differ on exactly how Atahualpa's litter finally came down. Some say that as bearers were killed, new ones rushed in to take their place, piling bodies beneath the platform to keep it aloft, until there was simply not enough left standing. Others describe Spaniards grabbing at the poles, hacking at the supports until the structure tilted and toppled. However it happened, the moment when the emperor fell from his raised seat to the ground was the pivot of the afternoon. Even then, the Spaniards did not kill him. They had gambled everything on capturing, not slaying, the ruler. Pizarro is said to have personally intervened to protect Atahualpa from his own men's blows, taking a wound in the hand while deflecting a sword. The emperor, pulled from the tangle of bodies, was seized, restrained, and hustled toward a secure building off the square. Around them, the killing continued for some time. Unarmed attendants cut down, warriors trying to fight back, overwhelmed in ones and twos by riders with steel weapons. Estimates of the dead vary wildly in the sources, some claiming thousands, others fewer. The numbers are hard to fix, blurred by memory, by propaganda, by the desire to magnify either victory or martyrdom. What seems clearer is that Spanish losses that day were minimal, while the shock to the Inca camp was enormous. Yet the body count, terrible as it was, mattered less in that first afternoon than the outcome in the centre. The undefeated empire's ruler, who had arrived at Cajamarca at the height of his confidence, was now a prisoner in a town he had expected to dominate. All the carefully ordered ranks outside the walls, all the generals and warriors and resources, suddenly faced a new and disorienting reality. The living embodiment of their authority was in foreign hands. As the sun lowered over the smoking, blood-slick stones of the square, some of the immediate noise subsided. Horses stamped, men shouted orders, distant cries echoed from beyond the town as confused warriors tried to understand what had happened. In one of the stone buildings, behind walls that had a few hours earlier concealed armed men, Atahualpa sat under guard, stunned, furious, calculating, or perhaps all three at once. In that room, more than in the square itself, the old balance of power had been broken. The trap that Pizarro had imagined in restless nights had sprung, not by annihilating an army in battle, but by reaching through a moment of misread ceremony to seize a single man. What that meant, for the Spaniards, for the Inca generals staring toward Cajamarca in disbelief, and for the people whose lives and loyalties would now be pulled in new directions, would unfold in the days and months to come. From a distance of centuries it is tempting to freeze that afternoon in Cajamarca into a single, simple image. A handful of Europeans with shining armour and strange animals, somehow defeating an ocean of people through sheer courage or superior weapons. The numbers alone invite that kind of story. 168 men, a few dozen horses, a few small cannon, against tens of thousands in the surrounding camps. How else could it have happened, the old narrative asks, if not that one side was simply stronger, smarter, or destined to win? But when you look more closely at the layers underneath that moment, the picture shifts. Cajamarca was not magic. It was not inevitable. It was a rupture made possible because so many other fractures already ran through the world it tore open. The first and most obvious factor was surprise, but not just the simple surprise of an ambush. Atahualpa did not walk into the square thinking he was going to war. He came in performing power, not preparing to survive a sudden assassination attempt. His litter, his regalia, his retinue, the spacing of his attendants, the limited weapons they carried, these belonged to a script of royal appearance and intimidation, not to battlefield formation. He expected awe, maybe some tense negotiation, perhaps a show of force later if these strangers proved insolent. He did not expect armoured men to explode out of doorways and charge straight at his person. Pizarro, on the other hand, had built the entire day around one possible outcome. His men knew in advance that this encounter would end in violence. They knew the signal that would start the attack. They knew their target. They had practiced in their heads, if not on a training ground, how they would move through a dense crowd, how they would protect one another, how they would close on the emperor and hold him alive. For them, the meeting in the square was already a battle. For Atahualpa's retinue, it was a ceremony that suddenly turned into something else. In that kind of shock, even a vast numerical advantage can become a trap of its own. The more bodies crammed into the square, the more confusion when the first horses surged into the mass. People pressed together cannot easily turn, cannot easily see where danger is coming from, cannot hear orders over the pulse of panic. Each fallen bearer, each scream, each backward shove rippled outward, jammed movement, broke lines of communication. The Empire had armies that could fight in disciplined formations, that could maneuver along those astonishing roads you heard about earlier. But on that afternoon, those armies were mostly outside the walls, looking inward at an event they did not fully understand. Surprise struck again at a different level, in the very nature of the threat. Horses, cannon, steel blades cutting through cloth armour and wooden shields, the sound of gunfire echoing like thunder from stone. None of these were simply better weapons in an abstract sense. They were highly specific shocks to people whose experience of war had prepared them for other dangers. It is one thing to meet an enemy whose slings, maces and spears you understand. It is another to see an unknown animal ridden by a metal-clad man crash into your friends with a force you have never seen before, while thunder and smoke explode at the edges of your vision. It did not help that this terror appeared in the middle of a civil war's aftermath. The empire that walked into Cajamarca that day was not the same unified power that had spread across the Andes in earlier generations. It had just finished tearing itself apart in a brutal conflict between two rival brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar. Entire regions had chosen sides. Generals had shifted loyalties. Armies had marched and countermarched, exhausting supplies, leaving scars. Atahualpa had won that struggle, but victory did not erase the fractures. Huáscar was still alive, held captive. His supporters were not all dead. Many nobles at Cajamarca had, not long before, backed a different claimant to the throne. Some had only recently come over to Atahualpa's side, and not always with their whole hearts. Others were biding their time, waiting to see how this new ruler would consolidate power, what rewards or punishments he would dispense. So when the Spaniards attacked and seized the emperor, the reaction among Inca elites was not entirely straightforward. Some were horrified, devoted to the person of the Sapa Inca, ready to die to defend him. Others, though, saw something more complicated. A sudden, incomprehensible crisis, layered on top of unresolved bitterness. The shock of the attack did not just strike the body of the empire, it hit a political order still unsettled, still negotiating its own loyalties. In that world, leadership mattered enormously. The Inca state had grown so large and held together so many different peoples by fusing roads and storehouses and armies to a central, almost sacred figure. The Sapa Inca was not just a king. He was the axis around which the political and spiritual world turned. His word could command labour from distant valleys, call warriors from highland provinces, reorder the flow of food and cloth and ritual. That kind of system is extraordinarily powerful when the person at the centre is visible, commanding, present. It is more vulnerable than it first appears when that person is suddenly not. When the Spaniards dragged Atahualpa out of the square and into a guarded room, they did more than capture a prisoner of high rank. They reached into the heart of a political machine that had been designed with the assumption that the emperor would always be in control of his own body. Orders in the Inca world had legitimacy because they were seen to come from the ruler or from clearly recognized representatives acting under his visible authority. Messages could move quickly along roads, but their power depended on who sent them and how their origin was understood. With Atahualpa under foreign guard, several paralyzing questions opened at once. Did orders issued in his name from that room truly carry his will? If generals outside the town received news of his capture, should they rush in to save him, risking his death, or hold back in the hope of negotiation? If word spread to other regions that the emperor was in chains, who had the right to claim to speak for the state? The system had protocols for succession after a death, for rulership passing to a son or sibling. It did not have a clear script for what to do when the living embodiment of authority was alive but constrained by unknown outsiders. From the Spanish perspective, this was the core of their gamble. 168 men could not defeat the armies of Tawantinsuyu in open battle. They could perhaps, if they were lucky and ruthless and coordinated, seize the one figure whose capture would freeze movement in the much larger organism facing them. The chaos in the square that afternoon was only the first phase. The deeper victory, from Pizarro's point of view, lay in what did not happen in the hours and days immediately afterward. No massive, coordinated counterattack surged down from the surrounding hills to wipe out the tiny force in Cajamarca. No general with an independent claim to legitimacy stepped forward with a clear mandate to act decisively, regardless of Atahualpa's fate. This does not mean that the Inca were passive, or that they simply stood in awe of European steel and horses. Some commanders did consider assaulting the town. There were skirmishes, probes, attempts to understand the strength and vulnerabilities of the strangers. Within the emperor's camp and among his advisers, arguments simmered. Attack now, wait and gather strength, negotiate, threaten, withdraw, and starve the intruders out. None of these options were cost-free. All had to be weighed against the risk that any move might lead the Spaniards to kill Atahualpa. In other words, many of the people who might have destroyed Pizarro's band were constrained not by fear alone, and not by some imagined sense of European invincibility, but by the logic of their own political and spiritual commitments. To act too aggressively against the captors risked sacrificing the very figure whose life gave their actions meaning. To act too cautiously risked letting a new and dangerous situation harden into a permanent change. The nature of the encounter itself also limited Inca options. It had not begun on a battlefield chosen by both sides. It began as a meeting proposed by foreigners whose intentions were only partly understood, in a stone town whose walls and tight streets favoured small numbers of highly motivated, heavily armed men. The empire's strength lay in its ability to move and concentrate large forces across mountains and valleys, to feed them from storehouses, to deploy them in terrain they knew. In Cajamarca, all that weight and reach could not easily be brought to bear in the sudden, narrow killing ground Pizarro had chosen. So when people later asked how could so few defeat so many, the answer was never just that the few had steel and horses. Those made a difference, but they were dramatic tools deployed into a moment already shaped by civil war, by a centralized system unprepared for the physical capture of its center, by misunderstanding, by the strange intimacy of an ambush disguised as diplomacy. Numbers by themselves rarely decide history. They have to be organized, directed, given a purpose that people recognize and are willing to die for. On that afternoon, in that square, only one side walked in with a clear, shared, ruthlessly simple goal: take the emperor. Everything else, questions of law, visions of empire, dreams of gold and salvation, was secondary for them in that hour. The Inca, by contrast, walked in with many goals layered together: to display majesty, to assess these newcomers, to fold them into existing patterns of hierarchy if possible, to project confidence after a bitter civil war. When the script changed without warning, when the strangers tore through ceremony with violence, the Empire's immense strength could not pivot instantly in unison. For a crucial span of time, it hesitated. That hesitation, measured not in years but in heartbeats and days, was enough. The trap in the square succeeded because the fractures were already there. The political divisions, the reliance on a single embodied ruler, the shock of new technologies, the limits of communication in a ritual context. One afternoon could not have broken 3 centuries of undefeated expansion if those cracks had not first been opened by other conflicts, other uncertainties. What happened in Cajamarca was not the whole story of the Empire's fall. It was an opening, a violent incision. The deeper unravelling would come later, in negotiations, in ransom, in shifting alliances, in decisions made by men who now had to navigate a world in which their Sun King no longer sat on his own throne, but in a foreign room under foreign guard. The room where Atahualpa was held was not large. Stone walls, a hard floor, a single opening to the air. But inside that simple space something immense began to take shape. One of the most famous bargains in the history of conquest, and one of the least stable. According to Spanish accounts, it started with a gesture. Atahualpa, brought under guard, looked around the room and asked how much space he was in. Then he raised his hand as high as he could reach and promised to fill that volume with gold. Not dust, not trinkets, but crafted objects, solid pieces, treasures that had once belonged in temples and palaces. On top of that, he would provide a larger quantity of silver in adjoining rooms. For the Spaniards this must have sounded like a miracle wrapped as an offer. They had come inland chasing rumours, hoping for spoils, picturing perhaps some chests of metal after long campaigns. Suddenly, the emperor of this vast land was proposing to concentrate unimaginable wealth in a place they controlled, and to do it voluntarily. All they had to do, on paper, was keep him alive long enough for the treasure to arrive. For Atahualpa, the logic looked different. In his world, precious metals were not merely money. They were the flesh of the sun and the bones of the moon. They adorned shrines, wrapped idols, marked status. The empire did not run on gold in the way European economies did. It ran on labour and control of people, on land and stored food, on cloth and ritual obligations. To offer gold, then, was not to hand over the foundation of his state. It was to strip away ornament, to sacrifice dazzling surfaces to preserve the core of power. In the calculus of an Andean ruler, the metals could be replaced through labour and mining in years to come. What could not easily be replaced was the living person of the sapper Inca, and the web of allegiance that clung to his body. The gap between these two understandings is part of what made his offer possible, and so dangerously ambiguous. To Spaniards, gold and silver were almost the point of exploration itself. Chronicles and letters home were full of hunger for it. To many of them, a room full of treasure was not a bargaining chip to restore a captive king. It was the reason they had crossed the ocean in the first place. Yet even within the Spanish camp, reactions were layered. Some, like Pizarro's more calculating companions, immediately began to think in terms of shares and divisions. Who would get how much? How would royal fifths be measured and sent back to the crown? Others saw potential in Atahualpa himself, not just as a prisoner, but as a tool. With the emperor under their hand, they could issue orders in his name, test the obedience of provinces, learn the shape of the empire. On Atahualpa's side, the offer of ransom opened different possibilities. One was straightforward: pay and be released. The Spaniards had, after all, taken hostages in other lands for gold and then sailed away. Stories of such dealings had probably not yet spread through the Andes, but there was nothing inherently impossible from his perspective about a bargain where foreigners took wealth and then removed themselves. Another possibility was subtler and perhaps more useful. By commanding that gold and silver be brought from across the empire, Atahualpa could test and reinforce his authority even from captivity. Messengers still ran, officials still obeyed, temples still responded to his word. If the ransom assembled smoothly, it would prove, to himself, to his advisers, to watching nobles, that the axis of power still ran through him, not through his captors. A third layer was simply time. As long as the ransom was incomplete, as long as caravans and porters were still on the roads, the situation was not fixed. Each day that passed was a day in which other commanders could gather troops, in which distant regions could take stock of the threat, in which rumours of strange invaders could be weighed against local realities. Even if Atahualpa did not consciously think in those terms, the effect was there. The negotiations stretched the uncertainty. So, treasure began to move. From cities like Cusco and from sacred shrines spread across mountains and valleys, objects were taken down from their places and sent toward Cajamarca. Life-sized figures of gold were dismantled. Panels and plates that had sheathed holy walls were pried off. Ornaments that had echoed the sun's light in ritual courtyards were bundled up for rough journeys over passes. Imagine the roads that earlier sections brought into focus now bearing a different cargo. Not stored maize and cloth for armies, but gleaming statues reshaped into ingots, ceremonial vessels carried beside simple tools, religious treasures wrapped in ordinary cloth to protect them from rain and hands. At way stations, porters rested and then lifted again, following orders that must have felt both shocking and necessary. As the wealth accumulated in Cajamarca, the mood among the Spaniards shifted. At first, they had been a small, strained band in a hostile land, one stroke of bad luck away from ruin. Now, room after room filled with confirmation that their gamble had worked beyond imagination. Some were elated, their minds already racing ahead to Spain, to estates, to titles bought with the proceeds of this astonishing hoard. Others were uneasy. Gold did not just represent reward. It represented attention, royal scrutiny, envy from other conquerors, disputes among comrades whose friendship had always been laced with rivalry. Greed moved close to fear. As the value of the ransom grew, so did the stakes attached to Atahualpa's person. While he lived, there was always the possibility that he might escape, or be rescued, and somehow reclaim what had been assembled. While he lived, he also remained a potential organizing point for resistance. To keep him was risky, to kill him was also risky. Between these options, suspicion began to bloom. Among Atahualpa's followers, the atmosphere around the captive emperor thickened with its own anxieties. Advisers debated what the Spaniards really intended. Did these men understand honor? Did they have any sense of reciprocity beyond immediate trade? Would they keep their word once the room was full, or had they already decided his fate? Atahualpa himself, according to reports coloured by Spanish pens, expressed confidence that he would be freed once the ransom was paid. Perhaps he did believe that. Perhaps, used to a world in which solemn promises within elite circles carried real weight, he projected some of that expectation onto his captors. Perhaps he thought that once they were rich beyond previous measure, they would have less reason to cling to him. Or perhaps he saw the ransom as one strand in a larger strategy. While the Spaniards counted bars and melted artworks into easier-to-divide lumps, while they argued over inventory, he could continue to send messages outward, continue to understand who was loyal and who hesitated. Time might erode the psychological shock of Cajamarca among distant garrisons. Commanders in the field might begin to think less of the emperor's chains and more of defending their regions, or pressing advantage against rivals. Meanwhile, the political uncertainty that had flickered in the empire even before the ambush did not simply pause. Huáscar, the rival brother, was still alive in captivity elsewhere. His existence remained a threat to Atahualpa's claim, and a potential resource for those who regretted choosing the wrong side. The Spaniards, learning of this, saw yet another axis of leverage. 2 royal prisoners instead of 1. Reports spread that Atahualpa ordered Huáscar killed to prevent the Spaniards from using him. If that is accurate, the act made chilling sense inside the logic of a civil war. It also deepened Spanish mistrust. Here was a man, they told themselves, capable of fratricide even under guard. What might he do if freed with his authority restored? At the same time, rumours circulated that armies were gathering at the edges of Spanish sight. Some Inca commanders tested the newcomers' strength, gauging their weapons and tactics. Others hung back, calculating. The longer the stalemate in Cajamarca lasted, the more opportunities there were for someone, somewhere, to try to break it. Inside the ransom room, these outside movements translated into whispered fears. What if a massive army finally appeared on the surrounding hills, ready to annihilate the small band of Spaniards? Would the locals attack suddenly? Could the emperor signal them from behind his guards? To men who had travelled so far and gained so much, The thought of losing it all in a single night tightened every nerve. It is here that you can see how unstable the arrangement always was. On paper, it looked like a straightforward contract, wealth in exchange for freedom. In reality, it was a web strained by incompatible expectations and by the widening gap between what each side had to lose. For Atahualpa and many around him, release might have meant not just personal survival, but a chance to reorganize, to reassert control, perhaps even to turn these strange foreigners into controlled allies or contained threats. The empire still existed beyond the walls of Cajamarca. Its roads were still intact, its stores still fed its people, its armies could be reassembled. For the Spaniards, release increasingly came to look like letting a lion out of a cage after you had just wounded it, and paraded its power before all its followers. They could not unknow the reach of Tawantinsuyu. They could not unsee the speed with which gold and silver had flowed at one man's command. Each treasure train that arrived underscored how dangerous that command could be, if not chained to their purposes. Greed egged on caution. Every new arrival of metal made it harder to contemplate walking away, empty-handed or even moderately rewarded. Every whisper of gathering native forces made it harder to imagine handing back the one hostage that gave them some safety. In that atmosphere, trust could barely sprout, let alone grow. Atahualpa, reading Spanish gestures through the lens of his own culture, may have hoped that the shared ritual of bargaining would create obligations. Spaniards, reading Inca behavior through their fears and preconceptions, saw plots in every council, threats in every delayed delivery, betrayal in every sign that the emperor still thought of himself as sovereign. None of this was predetermined. There were paths, at least in theory, that could have led to a different outcome. The ransom room could have been the place where two powers struck an unequal but lasting accommodation. Foreigners enriched and given a controlled foothold on the coast, the empire bruised but intact, its internal struggles continuing on Andean terms. To imagine that is not to indulge in fantasy, but to recognize that at this stage conquest was not yet a completed fact. One side held the emperor, the other still held the land, the people, the fields, the high passes. The negotiations around Atahualpa's ransom were not the mop-up after an inevitable victory. They were part of a fragile balancing act in which both sides were still probing for advantage. What tipped that balance was not a single decision but the slow accumulation of fear and desire. As the room in Cajamarca filled with metal, it also filled with the weight of all the futures each side dreaded. Spaniards imagining themselves wiped out by armies they had not yet seen. Inca nobles imagining their emperor shipped away across an ocean or reduced to a puppet under foreign swords. Between those imagined catastrophes, the space for compromise narrowed. The ransom, which had begun as a promise that might have opened a door, became instead another wedge driven into already present fractures of trust. What was meant to buy safety fed suspicion, what was supposed to stabilize the situation, helped drive it toward a point from which there would be no easy return. If you picture the fall of this empire as a clean line between invaders and invaded, it may be time to loosen that shape in your mind. Even before Atahualpa's fate was sealed, the ground under everyone's feet was crowded, not just with Spaniards and Inca nobles, but with other Andean peoples watching, judging, and choosing. The men who had ridden into Cajamarca had not come alone. The number 168 refers to Spaniards, but behind and around them moved hundreds, then thousands of indigenous allies. Porters, guides, fighters, interpreters, negotiators. Some had been drawn in from the coast and highlands as the Spaniards advanced inland. Others approached them after news of Cajamarca spread. Many of these peoples knew Tawantinsuyu not as a distant, benevolent order, but as a power that had pushed into their valleys, rearranged their fields, moved their kin, demanded labour and loyalty. For them, the Inca were not simply their own side, they were the empire. Civil war at the centre had already made this obvious. Lords and communities had chosen between Huasca and Atahualpa not out of pure principle, but out of old grudges, local rivalries, calculations about which patron would treat them better, or which would at least leave them alone. When Atahualpa triumphed, those who had backed the losing brother did not suddenly forget where they had stood. So when a third force appeared, strange men with animals that looked like monsters, weapons that cracked like thunder, and an emperor in chains, the political map did not flatten into us and them. It rippled. There were peoples who had never been fully folded into the empire's embrace. Some had submitted only recently. Others had been conquered decades earlier, but still remembered the autonomy they had lost. The gods whose temples had been overshadowed, the chiefs whose authority had been trimmed by imperial officials. To these groups, the shock of Cajamarca did not just mean danger. It meant possibility. You can imagine quiet conversations in mountain hamlets and valley towns. Not grand councils, perhaps, but whispered assessments. The Sapa Inca is a prisoner, they might have said. His generals are uncertain. The roads are crowded with porters carrying treasure to strangers. The storehouses, once symbols of imperial power, are flowing outward instead of feeding armies. If there was ever a time to press for old freedoms, to take back a shrine, to settle a score with a neighbouring lord tied too closely to Cusco, perhaps this was it. The Spaniards, for their part, were hungry not only for gold but for allies. They had seen in the Caribbean, in Mexico, and along the northern coasts of South America that Europeans rarely conquered by steel alone. They exploited divisions, made pacts, offered protection and vengeance in turn. In the Andes they began to do the same. They listened for resentment. They asked who had fought on which side of the civil war. They noticed which local lords sent food and which held back. They rewarded cooperation with trinkets, promises and exemptions. They punished defiance in ways designed to be seen. In some regions, interpreters explained to Andean leaders that these newcomers were enemies of the Inca, come to overthrow a tyrant. In others, they were presented as distant king's emissaries, whose favour could be courted against local rivals. The Spaniards did not have one consistent story, because they did not need one. They needed leverage. Local grievances could now be redirected like water down a new channel. A chief who had long chafed under an Inca governor might think, if I side with these foreigners, the governor's power will break and mine will grow. A town that had lost land to an imperial resettlement could imagine undoing that loss under the cover of chaos. None of this required anyone to think in terms of permanent conquest. For many, the Spaniards looked less like a new sovereign and more like an unexpected tool. Some saw them as a weapon to be aimed. If you help us defeat this rival, we will supply you with food and porters, they essentially proposed. If you march with us against the Sapa Inca's generals, we will show you safe passes, warn you of ambushes, guide you to storehouses. Others saw an opportunity for trade. Foreigners who valued gold and silver above all else might be persuaded to exchange them for textiles, for food, for services. They might pay well for interpreters and guides. Their strange animals might be useful in war. Their weapons could be copied in form, if not in material. Still others treated them as a temporary storm. You might lean into the wind for a season, shelter under strange sails, and then, once it passed, step back into a landscape rearranged more to your liking. From the Spanish side, chronicles sometimes flatten these alliances into proof of providence. The natives joined us because they saw we were destined to win. From the Andean side, where fragments of testimony survive, the logic looks more complicated. Many allies seem to have believed they were handling a dangerous force, using it to cut through imperial bonds, not imagining that the knife would eventually turn toward them. Sometimes this calculus was brutally specific. In the aftermath of Atahualpa's capture, some nobles who had supported Huascar reportedly approached Pizarro. Here, they hinted, was a way to topple the man who had defeated their champion. If the Sapa Inca was already caged, why not help the men who held the key? The Spaniards themselves were content to encourage such thoughts. They floated the idea of restoring Huascar, or of elevating another royal, or of ruling through a pliable puppet. Each option drew in different factions. Each promise could be made, tested, and, when no longer convenient, quietly discarded. Coalition politics, then, sat at the heart of the advance into the empire just as much as crossbows and cavalry did. In battle after battle that would follow Cajamarca, the Spaniards' numbers on paper were multiplied many times by indigenous troops. Men from rival ethnic groups marched under Spanish banners, fought against Inca armies, and sometimes against each other. They scouted terrain their European partners could barely read. They cut supply lines, misled imperial messengers, and turned local knowledge into strategic advantage for the newcomers. This does not make the conquest any less violent. It does make it less simple. The phrase, "the Spanish conquered the Inca," hides a multitude of choices by people who were neither Spanish nor fully Inca, and who had reasons rooted in their own histories for doing what they did. There were, for example, the Cañari in the north. Once important allies of the empire, they had been punished harshly when they backed Huáscar and lost. When Pizarro's men appeared and struck at Atahualpa, many Cañari saw a chance to reverse their fortunes. By aligning with the strangers, they could seek revenge on the faction that had humiliated them, regain prestige, perhaps even bargain for greater autonomy once the dust settled. Or the Chachapoya in the eastern slopes, taken into the empire with difficulty and kept in line by force and repeated campaigns. For some of them, joining the Spaniards promised release from a conqueror they already knew they disliked. Whether the new conqueror would be better was a question for another day. In the south, and later in the wars around Cusco and beyond, similar patterns recurred. Old enemies of the imperial heartland, or groups recently brought to heel, chose sides with eyes on their own maps, not on a European one. And loyalties did not stay fixed. Some allies changed camps when it seemed that the Spaniards were losing, or when their behaviour made plain that these foreigners did not intend to leave after a quick plunder. Others, who had initially held back or even fought against the newcomers, entered into agreements once it became clear that imperial power was not rebounding. You can trace a sort of grim learning across the years that followed Cajamarca. At first, many Andean leaders seem to have thought in short cycles: a battle, a campaign, a season. They judged the Spaniards like they judged other rivals, by immediate strength, and by whether they kept their word in the moment. As time went on and promises were broken, as encomiendas were imposed and demands for labour increased, some realised that what was happening was not just another turn of the internal wheel. The strangers were not a passing faction. They were building a new, harsher version of the thing the Inca had built, and they meant to place themselves permanently at its apex. By then, the web of alliances and betrayals was dense. Communities had compromised themselves in each other's eyes. Old supports had been severed. The empire that might once have coordinated resistance was fragmented, its symbols tarnished, its key cities under foreign garrisons. Even those who now regretted their early cooperation with the Spaniards could not easily undo what coalition politics had set in motion. To say that conquest emerged from these shifting loyalties is not to let European weapons off the hook. Steel blades and firearms mattered. Horses mattered. So did disease, which stalked ahead and alongside the conquerors, weakening populations in ways no local strategy could fully anticipate. But to focus only on those factors is to miss the human choices that made such a small group of outsiders able to move so far, so fast, through a land that had never before been subdued by foreign arms. Each alliance signed, each grudge harnessed, each calculation about whether to help the men with beards or the men with fringe crowns, chipped away at the coherence of imperial resistance. The Spaniards did not simply batter down a solid wall. They found cracks, widened them, and invited others to hammer from the inside. The fall of the undefeated empire, then, was not just the story of one afternoon in a square or the fate of one emperor in a stone room. It was also the story of countless decisions made in villages, fortresses and mountain passes by chiefs and commoners who had their own reasons for seeing the Inca not as a homeland to be defended at all costs, but as a power to be bargained with, manoeuvred around, or even overthrown. In that sense, the Spanish conquest was as much an Andean civil war extended and transformed as it was an invasion. Outsiders catalyzed and redirected conflicts that were already there, changed their scale and ultimately claimed the prize. But the energy that drove so much of it came from within the society they were breaking apart. From the quiet vantage of sleep, this tangle of motives and shifting alliances can seem almost dizzying, Yet it is in that tangle that the reality of what happened lives, not as a clean clash of civilizations, but as a storm of choices in which ally and enemy were labels that could change from one season to the next, while an empire that had long mastered the art of ruling many peoples found itself undone in part by those very peoples turning, for a brief and fateful time, to someone else. When Atahualpa finally died, it did not happen in a great hall before assembled lords, or in a battlefield duel where two champions met and one fell. It happened, by most accounts, in a town square, at dusk. The same man who had ridden into Cajamarca in a litter carried by scores of attendants, wrapped in the symbols of the sun, ended his life in the custody of men he had at first treated as curiosities. The chronicles describe an execution hastily decided, justified by accusations of treason, idolatry, and plotting against his captors. They speak of confessions extracted under pressure, of a trial whose outcome was never in doubt. They also tell of a choice offered at the end. Die by fire, the Spaniards reportedly said, or accept baptism and die by garrote. To an Andean ruler raised in a world where the preservation of the body mattered for the afterlife, where royal mummies were tended, fed, and consulted as if still living, fire was a terrible prospect. To be burned was not simply to die, it was to have one's future unmade. Whatever mix of fear, calculation, and hope moved him in that final hour, Atahualpa is said to have chosen the rope and the cross name Francisco over the flames. He died strangled, and the last Sapa Inca who had ruled from the north left this world as a Christian neophyte in Spanish eyes, and as something far more ambiguous in the eyes of his own people. For the Spaniards crowded around the execution, the moment could be framed as an end. The dangerous captive was gone. The ransom had been collected. The excuses had been written down in careful ink. He had plotted. He had ordered Huasca's death. He had refused true faith until the last instant. But power in the Andes did not rest on one man alone. Even the role of Sapa Inca, draped in sacred language, was woven into a larger fabric of kin, generals, priests, and provincial lords. When news of Atahualpa's death began to spread, the empire did not suddenly evaporate like mist under sunlight. It shuddered. In Cusco, the old capital in the high valleys, the royal line had not vanished. The civil war had killed and weakened many contenders, but branches of the dynasty still survived. Priests still tended temples. Administrators still kept tallies and quipicords. Local governors still expected labour from the communities under them. The Spaniards understood this well enough to see an opportunity. Killing Atahualpa removed a rival, but it did not give them a crown that Andean peoples would immediately recognise. To move from being dangerous guests and hostage-takers to something like rulers, they needed a figure through whom they could claim legitimacy in local terms. So almost as soon as they killed one Inca, they began looking for another. They heard of a prince in Cusco, Tupac Hualpa, sometimes called Tupapa, whom they could present as a rightful heir, someone untainted by Atahualpa's war and more pliable to their wishes. With his elevation they could march not as mere raiders, but as escorts of the new Sapa Inca, avenging him against the northern usurper's partisans. It was an audacious piece of political theatre. Imagine being an Andean noble on the road between Cajamarca and Cusco watching this procession approach. At its centre, a royal Inca carried in the old style wearing the signs of sovereignty, surrounded not by imperial veterans but by bearded men in steel and a teeming crowd of allies from rival ethnic groups. The message was confusing by design, continuity and disruption braided together. Behind the staging, the Spaniards pushed south. Their path toward Cusco was not a smooth, triumphal road. Inca generals still loyal to Atahualpa's line, such as Rumiñahui in the north, fought hard. Armies gathered on the high plains. Ambushes were laid in mountain passes. Some engagements were desperate enough that Spanish chroniclers, who liked to present victory as inevitable, admitted to fear. At each turn, though, the combination we have already seen reappeared. Indigenous allies tipping the balance, Spanish weapons and horses magnifying their effect, and the disorienting presence of a captive Inca, or later, a hastily crowned one, blurting the usual signals of war. Tupac Hualpa himself did not live long. On the march, he sickened and died, perhaps of natural illness, perhaps helped along by poison. His short-lived reign, if we can even call it that, left no time to build solid support. Yet his role shows the Spaniards' emerging pattern. Rulers could be elevated and discarded as needed, as long as the image of Inca authority could be kept flickering above their own. When they finally reached Cusco in late 1533, they did not find a vacant city. They entered a place traumatized by civil war, but still functioning, still dense with meaning. The great temples stood. Palaces of different royal lineages ringed the ceremonial core. Mummies of past rulers were said to reside there, mummified lords whose opinions still mattered. To claim the city was to claim the heart of Tawantinsuyu. They took it. Some Inca nobles resisted and died. Others calculated that open defiance would mean the destruction of their line and chose negotiation instead. The Spaniards installed another puppet, Manco Inca Yupanqui, a brother or half-brother of Huascar, presenting him as the new legitimate Sapa Inca. Through him, they hoped to harness the remaining machinery of empire, labor drafts, tribute, allegiance. On paper, it seemed a clever compromise. Spaniards could point to a royal figure in whose name they now operated. Andean subjects could tell themselves that the divine line of the sun still sat, however uneasily, on the throne. Underneath, strain grew. For Manco, the experience quickly became intolerable. Treated less as a sovereign and more as a convenient instrument, humiliated, constrained in his movements, he came to see that the men who had killed Atahualpa did not intend to restore a stable order with an Inca at its peak. They meant to bend the old order to themselves. His eventual decision to rebel, fleeing Cusco, raising armies, laying siege to the very city through which he had once allowed them to march, reminds us that Inca resistance did not end with Atahualpa's death, nor with the capture of the capital. It erupted, changed form, flickered and flared across years. In the highlands, commanders regrouped. Fortresses such as Sacsayhuaman became battlegrounds where Spanish garrisons, bolstered by allied indigenous troops, faced waves of attackers who knew every stone and slope. The fighting was bitter, victories were costly, the outcome felt for stretches of time uncertain to those living it. Farther afield, some regions defied Spanish control for decades. Others submitted outwardly while nurturing quiet opposition. Messengers travelled old roads with new kinds of news, not imperial edicts from Cusco, but rumours of uprisings, of punitive expeditions, of strange new burdens imposed in the name of foreign kings. From the perspective of villagers in these places, the fall of the undefeated empire did not look like a sudden cliff. It looked like overlapping waves. First, the civil war had sent one set of armies marching through their fields. Then the men from the sea, tangled with one royal faction and then another. Then a new Sapa Inca crowned under foreign eyes. Then that same Inca turned rebel. Each turn brought fresh demands for food, porters, fighters. Each brought new risks in choosing whom to support. Cajamarca, though, remained a pivot because of what it did to symbols as much as to armies. When a Sapa Inca could be seized by strangers in an enclosed square, made to sit as a prisoner while his generals hesitated outside the walls, the aura that had long shielded the imperial centre was pierced. Rumours of that puncture spread along the roads like a chill. For some, this meant despair. If even the child of the sun could be chained, what safety was left? For others, it meant permission. If the old order could be broken from without, perhaps it could be pushed from within. The authority of governors and tax collectors, once backed by the implicit threat of imperial might, suddenly felt less absolute. Spanish moves after Atahualpa's death worked with and against this shifting perception. By installing puppet rulers, they tried to keep the language and ceremony of Inca power alive, but under their own hand. By seizing Cusco, they physically occupied the ritual heart of the world as Andean cosmology described it. By parceling lands and communities into encomiendas for their followers, they began to cut the cords that had tied different regions to the capital, redirecting loyalty and labour toward Spanish patrons. At the same time, resistance, both open and hidden, worked to reimagine what the empire even meant. Some Inca loyalists who followed Manco into the remote stronghold of Vilcabamba saw themselves as the continuation of true sovereignty, a shadow court preserving legitimacy until better days. Others, in villages and towns, gradually shifted their focus from Cusco to more immediate centres of power, local curacas, ecclesiastical missions, Spanish towns that now mediated access to tools, animals and protection. Collapse, in other words, was not a clean break. It was a series of changes in where people looked when they asked, "Who can command me? Who can protect me? Who must I fear?" From a distance, centuries later, it is tempting to draw a straight line. Undefeated empire, strange invaders, one shattering encounter, then ruin. The drama of Cajamarca encourages that vision. The numbers are striking. The contrast is stark. A single afternoon is easier to hold in mind than the long grinding aftermath. But if you listen more closely to the traces left in chronicles, in legal petitions, in oral traditions that survived in altered form, a more layered picture emerges. People remembered Cajamarca as a turning point, yes, but not always for the same reasons the Spanish did. For some Andean storytellers, the humiliation and death of Atahualpa marked the moment when the sun's favour seemed to waver, when the ancient pact between rulers and gods faltered. For others, it became the place where ancestors had first seen the true danger of the men from across the sea, a warning not fully heeded in time. Later, as colonial rule deepened and generations grew up who had never known an independent Tawantinsuyu, Cajamarca hardened in memory into something like a mythic origin scene, the day when the old world began to end. The reality was more drawn out. Battles after Cajamarca mattered. The siege of Cuzco, the campaigns against Manco, the stubborn survival of Vilcabamba, the gradual spread of missionaries and administrators into valleys that had never seen an Inca army. All these were steps in a process that unfolded over decades. Yet that afternoon in the square, with its mix of surprise, blood, and sudden captivity, stayed at the centre of how people told the story, Spanish and Andean alike. Perhaps this is because it captured, in one concentrated moment, the feeling of a world being turned inside out. An emperor, who had never before faced defeat in the field, brought low without a pitched battle. A small group of foreigners proving that the unthinkable was now thinkable. Allies and enemies watching, some horrified, some calculating, all aware that something had broken that could not easily be made whole again. From the soft vantage of night, as we lie between waking and sleep, the distinction between an event and a process blurs. A single dream image can stand in for years of change. Cajamarca works like that in history. It is the dream image of an ending. But around it, before and after, stretch long corridors of struggle and adaptation, in which an empire did not simply fall, but was chipped apart, refashioned, and partially absorbed into a new order that still bore its scars. To understand the empire after the emperor, then, is to hold both truths at once, the shock of one afternoon and the slow, uneven unmaking that followed. If we step back now, away from the dust and the shouting, away from the square at Cajamarca and the sieges that followed, the question waits quietly in the background. What actually ended this empire that, for 3 centuries, had never truly lost? On the surface, it is simple to answer. We can say it ended when Spaniards came with guns, horses, steel, and a ruthless will to conquer. We can point to dates, to proclamations, to the moment when a Spanish king's name replaced the Sapa Incas in official rituals. But that answer, by itself, is too sharp and too clean. It is the sort of answer history often prefers because it fits neatly into a sentence. The reality that carried people from one world into another was less like a line and more like a knot. Part of the knot had been tied before the strangers ever appeared on the coast. The civil war between Huasca and Atahualpa didn't merely bruise the empire, it tore through the web of loyalties and expectations that had held Tawantinsuyu together. Armies marched back and forth over the same valleys, conscripting runners, porters, and fighters from communities that had only recently been brought into the imperial fold. Grain stores were emptied, fields went untilled, local rivalries were sharpened into dangerous edges. Generals swore to one prince or the other. Caracas gambled on who would emerge victorious, sometimes changing sides midstream. Old resentments over forced relocations, tribute demands, or earlier conquests resurfaced under the language of factional allegiance. By the time Atahualpa won, there were many across the empire who had suffered in his name, or in his brother's, or in both. Victory did not bring healing. Atahualpa's decision to have Huascar killed, removing a rival but also extinguishing a symbol of southern legitimacy, left a wound that never fully closed. For some, the northern usurper on the throne in Cusco was never quite a rightful Sapa Inca. For others, his death at Spanish hands removed the only figure strong enough to reknit the empire. Into this frayed and exhausted landscape walked Pizarro and his companions, bearing new diseases that had already run ahead of them. Smallpox, measles, and other infections from the Old World did not ask permission to cross borders. They likely began their work in the Andes years before Cajamarca, carried invisibly along the same roads that once bore imperial messengers. These diseases killed without regard for rank or battlefield, sweeping through towns and villages alike. They took children and elders, warriors and weavers, priests and administrators. They may have killed Huayna Capac, the great Inca ruler whose death helped trigger the succession crisis between Huascar and Atahualpa. They certainly thinned out the ranks of experienced officials and commanders, the people who knew how to make the complicated machinery of Tawantinsuyu hum. Imagine trying to govern an empire when many of the men who understood its routes and storage schedules, its rituals and compromises, had vanished in a few seasons. Imagine garrisons suddenly undermanned, harvest rituals disrupted, succession customs thrown into confusion as heirs died out of order. Disease did not just weaken bodies, it eroded institutional memory. Even in healthier times, the Inca political structure had built-in tensions. At its heart was the Sapa Inca, wrapped in divine symbolism, surrounded by kin, rivals, and claimants who might one day contest his line. Around him spread an elaborate system of reciprocity and obligation. The state demanded labour and loyalty, and in return it offered protection, food in years of famine, monumental projects that knit people into a shared story. To bring new regions into this system, the Inca often uprooted and resettled communities, moved colonists into frontier zones, and imposed administrators whose primary allegiance was to Cusco. Local leaders who cooperated were rewarded and honoured, but they were also bound tightly to the centre. Those who resisted were punished, sometimes harshly. Over generations, many people came to see themselves as part of the four quarters of the world that made up Tawantinsuyu. But beneath that layer of imperial identity, older affiliations remained, to valley and village, to ethnic group and local deity. As long as the centre was strong, these multiple identities could coexist. The imperial road brought benefits as well as burdens, and the aura around the Sapa Inca made resistance feel hopeless. The civil war, the diseases, and the sight of an emperor in chains disturbed this balance. When Atahualpa died as a captive, it was a shock not only to his supporters, but to everyone who had learned that the Sapa Inca was the axis of the cosmos. When Huascar died on his way to Cajamarca, strangled under orders from his rival, it signalled that royal blood itself could be spilled in new, unsettling ways. Without a single widely accepted centre of gravity, the empire's political structure became brittle. It could still command, but not with the old unquestioned authority. Orders were given, but they were second-guessed. Promises were made, but people wondered how long they would hold. Into that uncertainty flowed local resentments that had been stored up over years. Some provinces had never liked the Inca tax collectors. Some communities resented the meter labour drafts that took their young men away to build terraces, roads and temples far from home. Others nursed memories of earlier conquests, when their ancestors had been forced to adopt new gods, new ways of dressing, new ways of speaking. When the Spaniards arrived, they did not find a single, united mass facing them across the mountains. They found a mosaic. In that mosaic, some pieces were loyal to the dynasty, some to particular generals, some primarily to their own region. Some saw the newcomers as a terrifying threat. Others, watching carefully, saw them as a potential tool. Spanish tactics made full use of this. They did not try to fight the empire alone. From the beginning, they sought out allies among discontented groups, most famously the Huancas and the Cañares, who had reasons of their own to resent Cusco's rule. They promised these allies revenge, relief from burdens, a chance to reshape old hierarchies in their favour. Spanish weapons and horses in this context worked less as a single overwhelming force and more as a dangerous multiplier. A steel sword in itself was not enough to conquer a valley. A dozen horses could be surrounded and speared if left to face an army unsupported. But when those swords and horses operated alongside thousands of indigenous warriors who knew the terrain and the politics, the balance shifted. Tactics amplified this further. The Spaniards liked surprise attacks, narrow killing grounds, and capturing leaders. They understood, some from their own Iberian wars, some from watching the Andes, that if you could seize or discredit a figure at the top, the structure below might sag or split. Cajamarca was the most dramatic example, but the pattern repeated. Sudden strikes, targeted assassinations, the elevation of puppets, the elimination of rivals. Each move dug a little deeper into the fractures already present. So when people say the Inca Empire never lost until that afternoon at Cajamarca, what they are capturing is partly a truth and partly a simplification. For centuries, Tawantinsuyu had expanded, absorbed, and held its ground. There had been rebellions, there had been hard-fought campaigns against stubborn foes, but the overall story, until the early 1500s, was one of imperial momentum. The sun seemed always to rise on more territory under Inca control. In that sense, never lost reflects a political reality. No foreign power had marched into Cusco and dethroned the Sapa Inca. No outside enemy had dictated terms. It also reflects the way the empire wanted to see itself, and to be seen. Imperial propagandists, poets, and officials emphasized the inevitability of Inca victory, the benevolence of their rule, the incapacity of subject peoples to resist for long. The state's own storytelling smoothed over failures and celebrated triumphs. Over time, this official memory hardened into reputation. When later generations, including Spanish chroniclers and modern readers, looked back, that reputation was easy to adopt as fact. The long string of Inca successes appeared as an unbroken chain, but chains can have invisible flaws. Never Lost turns what was actually a complex record of wars, bargains, compromises, and regional tensions into something almost mythical. It makes Cajamarca feel like a lightning bolt striking a flawless tree. The image is powerful. It is also misleading, because by the time Pizarro set his trap, the empire had already been weakened by disease, shaken by civil war, and riddled with resentments that the Inca state had managed but never fully resolved. The Spaniards did not walk into a perfect, solid edifice. They walked into a structure with cracks, and then they hammered at those cracks day after day. History, though, has a habit of gathering these days and years of strain into one dramatic scene that we can easily picture. An emperor on a litter, trumpets, gunshots, screams, the rush of hooves in a crowded square, our minds like events that feel like turning points, battles, assassinations, declarations. They give us something to hold on to in a long flow of causes and effects. The day the empire fell is easier to say than the several decades in which political, social, biological and military pressures converged to transform a civilization. So we point to Cajamarca and say, here is where the undefeated empire finally lost. There is truth in that. Cajamarca did matter. Symbolically, it broke the spell around the Sapa Inca. Politically, it removed a key player at a delicate moment and gave the Spaniards a bargaining chip, in the form of captured gold and a captive ruler. Militarily, it terrified many who had never seen such violence compressed into so tight a space. But what really ended the empire was not one square, one day, or one man. It was the combination of an imperial system that concentrated so much authority in a single sacred figure that his loss created a gaping vacuum, a civil war that bled the state of trust and manpower, diseases that tore through populations who had no defences against them, local grievances that, when given a chance, turned outward and upward against Cusco, and newcomers skilled at exploiting all of these currents, using sharp steel and sharper politics. When all of these strands pulled in the same direction, the undefeated empire did not topple like a statue pushed from a pedestal. It buckled, slowly, unevenly, with pockets of fierce resistance and pockets of quick accommodation, until at last the old pattern of authority could no longer be sustained. In that sense, the empire looked strongest just before it began to break. From a distance, its roads still crisscrossed the mountains, its storehouses still stood along the valleys, its officials still counted tribute on quipu cords. Even as smallpox burned through villages and factions plotted in palaces, The outward shape of power remained impressive. This is one of the unsettling lessons that lingers when we trace the end of Tawantinsuyu. Empires often appear most solid when they are in fact most vulnerable. The stonework is still smooth, the ceremonies still unfold, the records still show order. Underneath, though, stress lines lengthen, unseen until something small, or something very visible like a band of strangers, pushes just hard enough. As you lie here, listening in the quiet, the story of this undefeated empire softens into something more than a tale of conquest. It becomes a reminder that no power, however vast, is immune to the slow work of time, to the accumulation of small frictions, to the sudden arrival of the unexpected. That a single afternoon can stand in memory for changes that actually took years to unfold. The Inca Empire did not vanish with Atahualpa's last breath, nor with the first Spanish flag raised over Cusco. It flowed onward into new forms, into colonial systems that borrowed its labour drafts and roadways, into Andean communities that learned to speak in the language of both sun and cross, into stories that still recall the names of long-ago rulers. What ended was not so much a people as a particular arrangement of power, a way of understanding how the world was ordered from a sacred centre out to the four quarters. In the hush of night, that ending feels less like a crash and more like a long, low rumble moving through the mountains. And even that rumble does not simply fade. It echoes, subtly, in the patterns that followed, in the landscapes and lives shaped by both empire and its loss. If you listen closely, through the centuries of retelling and forgetting, you can still hear that echo somewhere between a memory and a dream, carrying forward from Cajamarca and all that came before it. As the echo of that rumble fades, you might notice that this story still hangs in the mind in a particular way. Long after the names blur and the dates slide out of easy reach, the image remains, a mountain empire that had never been forced to kneel, and a small band of strangers who seemed to overturn it in an afternoon. It feels like a riddle disguised as a story. How could something so large fall to something so small, so quickly? That question has gripped people for centuries. Spanish chroniclers, writing not long after the events, framed Cajamarca as proof of divine favour, or of the bravery and cleverness of a few men on the ragged edge of the known world. Later readers saw it as an example of technology triumphing over numbers, or of cunning politics outmanoeuvring rigid tradition. Modern historians add disease, ecology, economics, and the slow work of imperial overreach to the list. Each generation, it seems, finds a different reflection in that square. Part of what fascinates us is the scale of the contrast. On one side, an empire that stretched for thousands of kilometres, with roads that crossed deserts and climbed passes where breath comes thin. Armies organised, supplied, and moved with a precision that impressed even their enemies. Storehouses carefully stocked. Rulers wrapped in sunborn ritual. On the other, fewer than 200 men, far from home, with no easy way back if things went wrong. The math feels wrong. Our minds want the bigger thing to win. So we come back to Cajamarca, turning it over like a smooth stone in the hand, looking for the secret crack. Was it Atahualpa's overconfidence, Pizarro's audacity, the psychological shock of guns and horses, or something deeper in the structure of the empire itself? Each answer satisfies for a moment, then slips away, making room for the next. The longer we look, the clearer one quiet lesson becomes. Dramatic endings are almost never only about the day they happen. They grow slowly, from causes that are often invisible while they are at work. The trap in the square only made sense because so many threads had already been pulled loose. The diseases that thinned out leaders and labourers, the civil war that turned brothers into enemies, the old resentments that waited for a chance to breathe. That pattern is not unique to the Andes. When we look at other turning points, cities sacked, dynasties overthrown, systems collapsing overnight, we often find the same shape hiding underneath. Years of strain, choices that seemed small at the time, compromises that stored up tension little by little. The spectacular moment is just when all of those quiet forces finally become visible at once. Cajamarca feels especially haunting because the Inca state had been so good for so long at absorbing shocks. Rebellions had been put down, distant regions had been integrated, roads and rituals stitched disparate peoples into something that, from the centre, looked solid, and complete. To many who lived under it, Tawantinsuyu must have felt like the way the world simply was. Then, in one crowded square, that certainty broke. Not completely, not instantly, but enough that the old story of inevitability could no longer be told in quite the same tone. A man believed to be the child of the sun was dragged from his golden litter. His captors, who did not even know the full reach of the empire they had stumbled into, suddenly stood at its symbolic heart. Stories that rearrange our sense of what is possible tend to linger. The tale of 168 men capturing an emperor who ruled millions does more than record an event. It pokes at our assumptions about power, security, and permanence. It whispers that the largest structures we can imagine may rest on foundations far more fragile than they seem, that a single, unexpected encounter can reveal just how many stresses have been accumulating out of sight. And yet, the Echo of Cajamarca is not only about loss or fragility, it is also about what continues after seeming endings. The empire as a political structure eventually gave way, but Andean communities did not vanish into the shock of that afternoon. Languages persisted, agricultural terraces continued to hold the soil, festivals adapted old meanings to new symbols. People who had once walked under banners of the sun learned, under colonial rule, to navigate a different set of authorities while remembering older ways in stories and in silence. So when we think of Cajamarca now, the image does not have to be frozen at the moment of attack, with the square choked in dust and fear. It can widen outward and forward in time. It can hold the long, uneven process by which an imperial order dissolved and something else, harder to name, stitched from both rupture and continuity, took shape in its place. There is a kind of gentleness in viewing history from this distance, especially as you listen in the quiet. The sharp edges soften. Individuals who once stood as heroes or villains in rigid tales become people moving inside constraints they did not fully choose. An emperor bound to embody a cosmic order, a conquistador trying to turn risk into reward, a villager weighing loyalty to Cusco against hunger, or fear, or hope for local autonomy. Seen this way, Cajamarca is less a morality play, and more a moment where many currents met. This is one reason the story still draws us. It lets us ask questions without needing final answers. How do we recognize the slow-building pressures in our own time? How do we tell the difference between something that is merely shaken and something that is quietly beginning to break? Which alliances we take for granted might already be shifting under our feet? The Inca could not see all the ways disease, politics, and discontent were converging. We, looking back, can trace those lines. It is both humbling and strangely calming to remember that we are always living inside processes we only partly understand. If you find your thoughts drifting now to other empires, other turning points, or to your own life, that too is part of the long echo of Cajamarca. A single afternoon in 1532 becomes a soft reminder that power is never absolute, that stability is often temporary, and that the stories we tell about never losing or falling in a day are, at best, shortcuts through landscapes of much greater complexity. And then, beyond the stories and the explanations, there is the land itself. Imagine the Andes after the clash, when the noise had drained away. The square of Cajamarca emptying slowly, the last shouts fading, the dust beginning to settle. Above the town, the mountains stand as they have stood for ages, ridges layered against the sky, their upper slopes catching the evening light. Far from the plaza, the chill of night seeps into stone and soil. A shepherd gathers his animals. A stream moves through a narrow ravine, its sound unchanged. Somewhere, perhaps, a runner pauses on a high path, looking back toward the direction of the city without yet knowing what has happened there. The same constellations that watched over the emperor's wheel overhead. Frost forms on grass. A terraced hillside waits for morning sun. Empires rise and fall within that vastness, their triumphs and disasters compressed into brief sparks against the backdrop of rock and cloud. As you rest here, you can let that larger scale be your last thought. The patient lines of the mountains, the thin air, the quiet after all the shouting. Cajamarca becomes one note in a much longer song, its echo travelling outward through centuries of memory, scholarship and story, until it reaches you now, wherever you are. If this journey through the undefeated empire and its unravelling has kept you company tonight, you're welcome to gently support the channel so we can explore more histories like this together. You can tap like or subscribe if you'd like to be here for the next story, or leave a comment with any thoughts that are still drifting through your mind. And if you feel like sharing, I'd love to know where you're listening from, what part of the world you're in as you lie there, hearing about roads in the clouds and a square in Cajamarca. For now, you can let the mountains fade into darkness, the echoes grow distant, and the long story of empires and afternoons narrow again to your own quiet breathing, here at the edge of sleep.